standing in the forest next to the young man. The girl turned to him and asked him to take good care of her horse, give it clean water twice a day, and feed it fresh grass once a week. A second later, she abruptly added that if her horse lost even a kilogram of weight, the young man would have problems, although it was clear from the guy's satisfied face that he understood everything. In the next minute, somewhere on the other side of the country, a middle-aged man, threatening someone, demanded that they give him the treasure, and did it peacefully. It was about a young man lying face down on the ground, listening to threats that if he didn't obey, he would be deprived of something. The very next second, a red-haired beauty appeared on the computer screen, reporting on the third stage of combat training and noting that comparing this guy to Sugu was complete nonsense. At the same time, a young man sat in the room, looking at rather strange objects and noting to himself that he had never seen such amazing equipment before. On the table in front of the guy lay a notebook with a 5-year plan for turning into a villain. The next moment, the notebook was in the hands of the young man, and from somewhere in the distance a voice was heard informing him that an order had been given for his arrest, sent to all the feudal houses. The girl who spoke of the voice warned the young man against sticking his head out of the house unnecessarily. In a calm voice, the young man asked the beauty not to worry, noting that he never attacks first, and besides, no one will touch him, since he will hide as best he can. The beautiful brunette looked into the distance with amazement and surprise, as if she was considering her next steps or the steps of this guy. In the small room, one could see an unmade bed and on the floor a stack of handwritten leaflets, crumpled and thrown directly into the street. A stranger sat at the computer, about to draw a dragon, looking at the screen, which displayed the inscription about a team of gamers engaged in training. However, the young man did not have time for this, as he was distracted by the ringing of his mobile phone, which he immediately rushed to answer. The voice addressed Wu Jin and asked him to help with the game Ancient Ruins, as the interlocutor really wanted to complete it, and added that there would be interesting new equipment as a reward. The young man didn't understand the rush, but the voice on the other end of the line informed him that it was the opening of a new server, which meant there were many opportunities to rise to the top. Wu Jin seemed to be less interested in this because he hung up the phone, and the voice continued to sound, telling him that he needed to hurry up because others might hear all the interesting stuff. With a smile in his eyes, the young man remarked to himself that he did not understand who said that money could only be earned after joining the game. And the very next second, this guy typed a message on someone's computer saying that his server was freezing and he couldn't log in, so he was going to do his summer homework. Sitting in his computer chair and doing pull-ups, the young man thought that there are many ways to make good money. In the modern world, all you need is ingenuity. He was about to think about something else, but the next moment, the melody of a popular song about a heart-shaped flower started playing on his phone. After answering the call, the young man heard a strange message. Some girl accused him of not coming, despite the fact that he was going to marry her. Not understanding what was happening, the guy shouted that the beauty had dialed the wrong number, assuring her that he was absolutely single and had no plans to fall in love with anyone or start a relationship in the near future. However, the female voice did not stop, continuing to emphasize that the guy could not forget about his promise. He must take responsibility and definitely marry her. The next moment, something extremely strange happened. A vortex appeared on the monitor screen, which seemed about to suck in everything that got in its way. The funnel grew larger with each passing minute, and the young man watching everything that was happening could not believe his eyes that all this was really happening. The blue light emanating from the computer screen spread throughout the room and began to swirl into a large stream, covering everything in its path. The guy, spinning along with the chair, screamed in horror, not understanding what was happening in his room and what all this would ultimately lead to. The next second, against the backdrop of all this brightness, the young man was extremely difficult to see. It seemed that only a leg and a slipper remained of him. But a moment later, even that was gone. The slipper the young man had been wearing some time ago lay on the floor, and his t-shirt was fluttering in the wind. At the same time, a message appeared on the computer screen stating that this person's place in the queue was 9527 and that a new server was opening today. The first day of testing had begun. Ahead of us lay the Old City. This was the Tianyuan continent, where the history of the Great Xia dynasty unfolded. There were many beautiful buildings in the courtyard, but the one that stood out the most was the one that had the inscription Assembly Hall on it. There were two people in the room, animatedly discussing the 1,000-year-old herb Scarlet Flame, which must grow on this continent and which needed to be obtained urgently. The man who spoke of one of the voices turned to the girl and told her that a young princess had sent a representative to the auction to try to get her hands on the herb. The man went on to point out that the plant was like a precious stone, so there would be competition from all sides, but they were citizens of Deja and therefore had to act according to the law. In an instant, The girl's companion flew into the air and shouted words of gratitude after her and wished Madame Qian all the best. Soaring above the clouds, Tsongkhapa's valiant disciple, Qian Shui, thought that the 1,000-year-old scarlet firegrass would help her suppress the icy cold in her body that she had inherited from her mother. After some time, while walking through the forest, the beauty also realized that in addition to the princess, many clans living in the city would hunt for the herb she needed. Perhaps the beauty would have continued to think about something, but her train of thought was interrupted by some incomprehensible noise coming from the dense thickets of the forest. The girl did not understand what was happening, because an incomprehensible light appeared in the clearing, and it seemed as if a whirlwind was trying to surround everything around. However, after just a minute, the girl's gaze fell on a group of 3 young people, one of whom began to whine and shout that she shouldn't be afraid since everyone was already there. The girl looked at the guys in surprise and wondered what they were doing there, but it turned out that they were in the forest, since an order had been given to detain the man who attacked the girls. The young man, who was on the verge of tears just a few seconds ago, walked up to Qian Shui and, as if wanting to show off, told her that he had washed his clothes today. And then, approaching the beauty, he noticed that there were rumors that in distant Fenglu there was a certain ignoble man who had disgraced many girls all over China. After a moment, he continued, noting that his older brother had told him that if the young man managed to catch the man, he would be able to make good money, and with the money he would be able to buy the scarlet flame plant. And smiling, he added that the sooner he could use this herb, the sooner the clan could reach a new level and take a dominant position in Qianling City. Without further ado, the beauty slapped him, threateningly declaring that the young man dreamed too much and should think more down to earth. Besides, Fenglu has a bad reputation, so he could have made up the whole story about the criminal, and even if not, no one had seen him, so how would they look for him? With a dreamy look, the fat man said that, despite this, the brothers really hoped that they would just be lucky and would easily catch the one they needed. Turning away from the guys, the beauty left, only warning them that they shouldn't forget about training and at least take care of themselves a little. Finally, she asked the boys where her older brother, Wu Jin, was. Before Zhen could finish explaining why she needed him, she turned her attention to the tree the fat man was pointing to. For a moment, our heroine froze because it became very light around, and the entire forest began to be enveloped in a bluish light. A moment later, the beauty noticed that she saw the skeleton of a man who was shouting something or flying from somewhere. All this did not last long, because the next moment the young man was sitting in a computer chair in front of a large tree, crossing his legs and smiling happily at something. The boys looked at each other with bewilderment in their eyes, trying to understand what had just happened and how it was possible. The young man seemed to be unable to understand how he had ended up in this situation, as he was struck by the ancient houses and the very dense forest, which had certainly not been seen in his area before. Lost in his thoughts, the young man began to carefully examine the girl, realizing how attractive and charming she was. And just a second later, looking into the beauty's eyes, he noticed to himself that everything that was happening was amazing and exciting, but he liked it all. The young man collected his thoughts and, turning to himself, noted that his experience of reading allowed him, firstly, not to get confused, and secondly, to understand that he had made a transition in time. Realizing how wonderful everything around him was, the young man decided that it was time to become the main character, the one he had wanted to be for so long. Continuing to carefully examine everything around, the young man thought over his plan of action in such a way as not to look like a fool against the background of all these people. So he frowned with displeasure, grabbed his head, and, addressing the girl as a sister, asked her to explain who they were and where they were, claiming that after the lightning strike he had lost his memory. Looking at the frightened girl, the fat man turned to her and tried to explain something. It seemed as if some thought had occurred to him. And a second later he added that he had once heard that a person, if very frightened, could lose his memory and even change greatly after that. He added, stumbling slightly, that in fact curing such a disease is not difficult, but simply necessary. But the guy did not have time to finish the sentence because the girl interrupted him. In a calm and reasonable voice, the beauty added that the disease of memory loss can indeed be eradicated, and all it takes is to scare the person. Realizing that this was the most motivating thing, Qian Shui threw the spear towards the seated young man, and it landed a few millimeters from his groin. The guy, jumping up abruptly, barely noticed that the chair had broken into 2 pieces, realizing that the beauty was an excellent shot, but at the same time that he was not in the best position. A group of guys gathered around the young man and, while making fun of each other, began telling him about a bad man who was attacking girls and also asked about his health. Listening to all this, the young man found it difficult to collect his thoughts. He did not understand why they were addressing him as a brother, who was the one who had committed the crime against the girls and who needed to be caught, and whether his family really had a high social status. True, after just a couple of seconds, the young man decided that everything needed to be done in order, and so he asked the fat man what his name was. Having learned that the young man's name was Chi-do, our hero asked him for his clothes, but, having agreed, did not realize that he was going to take almost everything off him. And then one of the guys advised the young man to think about improving his fighting skills, because he would probably want to become an older brother. And while our hero smiled maliciously, declaring that he would definitely think about the proposal, the young man also tried to catch up with the beauty in order to win her favor. He thought that his reputation in this family was probably not the best, so he had to win everyone's trust. After overtaking Qian Shui, the young man stated that the girl was probably very busy, and if that was the case, he could go catch the villain to at least help her a little. And in order to somehow justify his actions, he decided to add that he would do everything himself, plus he would also train, while simultaneously drawing attention to the beauty's amazement. Continuing to walk forward, the beauty hinted to the young man that the criminal was physically very strong, at least according to rumors. Not noticing the man in black, the girl noted that she did not intend to mourn his death, and therefore would not let him go anywhere. The very next second, someone's foot slipped, and he flew off somewhere, and the falling man shouted something unintelligible. The stranger, dressed in black and covering his face with a mask, was either flying or jumping, but his facial expression clearly did not indicate pleasure. There were other people in the courtyard who, while talking about something of their own, involuntarily heard some strange noise, which our heroes noticed without understanding where it was coming from. However, a second later the boys froze, looking at something that opened up before their eyes, not understanding how this could have happened. In the center of the courtyard sat the same man who had slipped and fallen a minute ago, and our hero, looking at him and turning to the crowd, noticed that the man was wearing a mask. Chi-do was the first to speak, informing everyone gathered that the person in the courtyard was none other than a criminal who had been wanted for several months. Stepping forward, our hero decided that his moment had come, so he turned to the others and shouted to protect his older sister. The fat man noticed with joy in his eyes that his sister was a real clairvoyant, because she believed that they could find this man without even knowing him, although he did not understand that the girl was saying this as a joke. Chi-do was about to say something to his newfound brother, but as he turned to him and began his speech, he noticed that he was no longer nearby. And at that very moment, the young man walked towards the stranger, noting to himself an incredible surge of strength and thinking that everything that was happening was the world of immortal cultivators. Our hero noted to himself that his stupid brothers were not going to do anything, although he himself understood that the enemy was quite weak, which meant that he could get rid of him and win the beauty's trust. The enemy looked truly unwell, and so he repeated to himself that if it were possible, he would ask Wu Jin to collect medicinal herbs for him. The man was about to think about something else, but the next moment our hero shouted, turning to him and accusing him of lusting after his beautiful sister. The stranger seemed to understand nothing, because he stood motionless with his eyes wide open in surprise and waited to see what would happen next. And then the young man clenched the fingers of his left hand into a fist, clearly intending to hit the stranger, demonstrating to everyone what a hero he was. However, this did not frighten the ninja in the least. He asked the boy what he thought a surprise attack should look like and, smiling, called our hero a naive fool. And as this guy was advancing on the stranger, he thought that this man in black might not be as bad as Wu Jin initially thought, but despite this, the guy couldn't be wrong. The next minute, the ninja removed his mask, revealing an elderly man peering into the distance while the young man studied the stranger with fear. The man was clearly taken aback by hearing him address him as grandpa, but it was clear that it made him laugh because he was about to teach our hero a lesson. However, he ran up to the stranger in one leap and began to press on his eyeballs, demonstrating his superiority to everyone. The next moment, the ninja approached the young man and began to ask in an angry voice how he dared to strike the old man straight in the soul, touching his eyes. However, this did not bother the young man at all, since this time he decided to hit not only the eyes, but also the man's other most vulnerable spots. It seems our hero succeeded, because the very next second the beaten and exhausted stranger fell to the ground and insulted his offender with the most obscene words. Standing before the stranger, the young man boasted that his last name was Yu, and that he should not only remember it, but also tell everyone what a hero he was and that it was better not to mess with him. To make his words sound as convincing as possible, the man grabbed him by the collar and, asking questions, asked why such an elderly man continued to be interested in young girls. Although a second later, he noticed that this question did not concern him at all. The most important thing was that no one touched his sister. But the very next moment, the young man was stopped by a message that appeared out of nowhere, congratulating him that the superhero development system had been activated for him. The brothers, watching in horror as what was happening, seemed to not believe their eyes and did not understand how Wu Jin was able to single-handedly neutralize the enemy. But our hero was not surprised by this, but he was surprised that the system panel awarded him 78 points for scaring his brothers, although he was puzzled as to why they were so scared. The next moment, the boy started smiling because he was awarded points and because of his older sister's joy, and this flattered our hero the most. While Wu Jin was rejoicing, his younger brothers woke up their teacher, asked about his condition, and warned him that he had not yet made a will, but was already determined to fight. It seemed that our hero had finally begun to understand why everyone was so shocked by what was happening, because the reason was that he had defeated a respected person. Having recovered somewhat from the shock, the master jumped up and began to threaten Wu Jin, saying that when he came to his senses, he would definitely take revenge. The young man, realizing that he had kicked the head of his clan, began to retreat, apologizing and making excuses, hinting at short-term memory loss. However, no one seemed to believe it. Chi-do, for example, thought this guy had dared to beat up such an important person just to please their sister. At the same time, with each passing second, the owner became more and more furious. It seemed that no one had ever seen him in such a state. And despite all the brothers' persuasion, the man suddenly rose from his seat, grabbed his sword, and said that he would never forgive such rudeness. Wu Jin, who was watching everything that was happening, remarked to himself that he did not understand anything, because he had never seen anything like this before. And while our hero was deep in thought, the master continued, noting that this guy should ask his brother to light a candle for his soul. In the end, the young man's actions were completely unjustifiable, and it seemed the teacher's words had finally gotten through to him. The next second, cutting the air with his sword and summoning flames from somewhere, the master jumped up and spun in the air. It seemed that he had become absolutely invulnerable. Our hero, barely understanding what kind of aerial technique this man had resorted to, realized that his chances were quite slim. Against the backdrop of the flames, the owner appeared not only menacing, but also extremely experienced and strong. He was completely different from the man who had lain exhausted just a few minutes earlier. Wu Jin didn't understand why he was sent to this world, because if he had received a little more, the teacher would have dealt with him, leaving him no chance of salvation. So, after thinking about it, the young man decided that the only way to survive was to run as fast as possible so that the owner could not catch up with him. Those gathered in the courtyard watched attentively what was happening, not believing their eyes, but also not wanting to interfere in this story. Wu Jin remembered that he was participating in a game, which meant he could exchange points for something useful. Continuing to hide from his pursuer, our hero quickly shouted, asking the system to display the exchange window right in front of him. In the next few minutes, the young man saw a regular monitor screen with the word inventory written on it. After quickly examining the menu, our hero noticed with surprise and horror that, apart from potions and elixirs, skills, equipment, and accessories, there was nothing else there. Realizing that he had less and less time, the young man decided to give preference to accessories, realizing that they would come in handy no matter what. Within seconds, various options began to appear on the screen, but the young man seemed to be having a hard time making a decision. The first image showed moss, which helps bring back spirits, and the second one showed a decorative box. Seeing the purpose of all these items, Wu Jin became more and more surprised with each passing minute, realizing that these things were incredibly strange and were unlikely to save him from the evil master. The guy knew he needed something completely new, but before he could press the button, he stepped on a splinter that looked like a kite's leg. Having stumbled, our hero realized the next second that he was flying somewhere, and most likely his landing would not be the softest. The owner, observing everything that was happening, realized that it would be difficult to grab such a person with bare hands, so he needed to come up with something more interesting. Our hero, lying face down on the ground, heard the owner ask him in an angry voice whether he had enjoyed beating the old man. A minute later, the man approached the boy, grabbed him by the hind legs, and, dragging the resisting young man along the ground, smiling, said that he would not bury him, leaving this matter to his relatives. Perhaps this story would have ended sadly, but the next minute a voice was heard behind the old man, begging the owner to stop. Turning around, the old man saw Qian Shui, and without waiting for the girl to object, asked who she was going to stand up for, since this young man was not worthy of even her finger. Hearing the conversation, the young man began to cry theatrically, realizing the inevitability of the situation, understanding that he was not a hero, but simply needed help. Turning to the teacher, the girl was perplexed as to why, If this young man was nothing special, so much attention was being drawn to him. With a sly smile, the man noted that all this only seemed to the beauty, but in fact the teacher just wanted to punish the scoundrel and nothing more. The old man gave the impression of being a complex person, as some kind of bad intentions could be read on his face, and the bag he was holding in his hands looked strange. Our hero also noticed this bag, realizing that it contained something that the owner would not want to show to everyone. So the next moment he joyfully raised his hand, symbolizing possible freedom and believing that the old man's backpack was a chance for survival. With a deft movement, the bag quickly moved from the gray-haired man to the young man, who lifted it as high as he could. Seeing the young man holding the bag, the owner shouted loudly, demanding that he immediately return the thing that did not belong to him. Turning his back to the crowd, Wu Jin addressed the teacher in a sarcastic tone, stating that he would just take a look inside. The brothers, who also witnessed the conversation, were eagerly awaiting and assumed that the bag might contain untold riches. And at that very moment, the teacher was still looking at the boy with anger and displeasure, hoping that he would not dare to look inside. The young man thought to himself that, having watched so many movies about moving to another time, he knew for sure that this bag was not an ordinary one. However, the next moment, the teacher seemed to have an idea, and he began to tell about how he encountered some evil spirits in the forest. It all started when, due to insomnia, he decided to watch the stars and look at the sky while sitting on the terrace, after which he felt the faint presence of some spirit. While the teacher, inspired by the story of the fable, our hero decided that it was time to look into the bag. Turning away from everyone present and listening to the fierce battle with half an ear, the young man shook out several trinkets from his backpack. The next moment, his eyes widened in surprise, but the reason for this was extremely difficult to explain. While our hero was busy with his own affairs, the old man did not give up and told how, thanks to his wisdom and cunning, he managed to defeat the evil spirits. The genie approached him, holding something in his hands, and asked if the evil spirit was a beautiful girl. Turning around, the owner saw that the young man was holding a skirt in his hands, but from the expression on the old man's face, one could say with certainty that he was seeing it for the first time. And this was indeed the case, because the next second, the fat man Chi-Do, running up to his interlocutors, joyfully shouted that this skirt belonged to him. Our hero was about to make a joke about this piece of clothing, but the fat man quickly explained that the skirt belonged to a girl he had met before arriving in this city. Realizing that something was wrong with this story, Wu Jin turned to his teacher and wondered where this creature could have come from in the cave of evil spirits. But before the teacher could answer, one of the brothers took the sacred stone and said that it belonged to him, and even the smell of cologne remained on it. The second grabbed the bushy bay pagoda, noting that he had always kept the figurine under his bed and had not taken it out since he bought it. The third grabbed his jade bracelet, which, apparently, was also very important and memorable for its owner. Realizing that all these things had been stolen, our hero began to demand an explanation from the owner, but he explained in a sarcastic tone that other things could happen in a large family. And then, remembering how it all began, he told the young man that it would be better to postpone the conversation until better times, because he was going to finish what he had started. Shui intervened in the conversation and said in an angry voice that the teacher had been drinking a lot lately, did not devote time to the students, and also neglected his family, and was now stealing. Wu Jin, standing behind the beauty, quietly, but so that everyone could hear, whispered under his breath that thanks to his actions, such a difficult case was solved. The brothers looked at the young man with joy, and he only noted to himself that the battle was not easy, but he managed to win again and earn points. And at that moment, still looking menacingly at the teacher, the girl turned to him again, asking if he wanted to tell her anything else. The master believed that he needed to somehow get out of this situation, otherwise everything would end as badly as possible for him. Pretending to be thinking about something or remembering something, he spun a small fiery whirlwind behind his back. The next minute, the whirlwind rose into the air and turned into a beautiful and large circle of fire. Everyone gathered looked at him in amazement when they heard that on a clear day disasters would not befall all of Kyushu, but no one understood what this meant. In the very next moment, the owner climbed onto the fiery phoenix and continued shouting that their humble servant was saying goodbye to them. But the boys must remember that at the right moment, they must lock all the doors. With sadness in his voice, our hero noted to himself that this man had spent half a day on this cheap performance, and in the end had simply run away. Switching to the beauty, he turned to her and asked if she was very upset, but without waiting for an answer, he added that he would be happy to help her overcome this grief. The brunette calmly replied that nothing of the sort had happened and suggested returning to the forest to watch the young man's training. However, The brother sitting nearby objected, noting that it would be better for the guy to rest first and then go to training. Apparently, the girl didn't hear any of this because she raised her frozen hands, noting to herself that nothing was helping her cope with the cold. Her limbs were so icy that frost emanated from them, and the beauty realized that the situation was getting worse with each passing day. Looking at the night sky, the girl repeated the name of the 1,000-year-old scarlet fire grass out loud over and over again. Dressed in traditional clothing and sitting in front of the mirror, Wu Jin thought to himself that he was a real handsome man, and if he were a girl, he would definitely fall in love with such a guy. A minute later, our hero decided that he needed to spend some time figuring out how the system worked. He went to the main menu, which immediately appeared on the screen, and selected the potions and elixirs section, noting to himself that first of all he needed to gain strength. The first thing that caught the young man's attention was the spiritual fruit, the main ability of which is to increase strength, and it must be said that this interested Wu Jin. Continuing to carefully study this fruit, the young man decided that he definitely had to try it. The next second, our hero clicked on the corresponding card to try again what was offered to him. Chewing the unknown fruit carefully, the young man noticed that it really did taste strange, although he didn't taste anything else. With each passing second, the young man listened more and more to his feelings, trying to catch at least something. After a while, a bright flame flared up in Wu Jin's chest, and the young man was filled with energy that seemed to fill the entire room. Sitting in front of the transparent screen, the young man said out loud that the sensations were truly amazing, and it was the most pleasant thing that had happened to him in a long time. But our hero was pleased not only by this, but also by the fact that he acquired a new skill called the 7 stages of bodily suffering. The young man didn't understand what this meant, but he was well aware that just one fruit gave him the opportunity to increase his level by 2 at once, which was an incredible success. Stepping aside a little, Wu Jin saw the cracked tile where he had just stood and realized how strong he had become in just a few minutes. Delighted with the results, our hero came up with an interesting idea. He decided to eat as much fruit as possible to see what would happen. But before that, when I returned to the menu and clicked on the highest level skills, I was surprised to find that they were still locked, meaning that eating the fruits would have no effect. The guy might have been upset, but not Wu Jing, who decided that he was fine because he was incredibly cool and handsome. And a second later, the joyful young man thought that this was a very interesting system that would be useful to him in the future. With such a weapon in his possession, the young man decided it was time to think of a plan to fight the criminal in order to gain even more experience and increase his level. With a sparkle in his eyes, the young man began to dream about how he would become the head of perhaps even the city he was currently in, and then be able to conquer new territories and increase his power. The next minute, the hero began to thoroughly search the room he was in, trying to gather as much information as possible. He then turned around and noticed a vase on the bedside table, thinking there might be something there. The guy held the object in his hands for a while, realizing that he was holding a completely ordinary vase, after which he switched to something else. The young man became interested in the mirror, moved it aside, and discovered a small niche in the wall, and inside the niche lay a small bag. Holding the bundle in his hand, the young man felt a negative feeling, but still continued to untie it, hoping to find something interesting and useful for himself there. For a while, our hero simply looked at the package, wondering what could be hidden in it, since, apparently, it had been stored for quite a long time. When Jean finally opened the bag, his gaze fell on the ninja clothes, but the young man did not understand why he needed them. Next came a dagger, a small bottle, and a pipe that looked more like a chicken pipe. The last one was a blue notebook with a strange inscription that said it was a 5-year plan to eliminate the villains. Looking at all this, the guy felt something very strange, but did not understand what exactly. When Wu Jin opened the diary, he did not understand what it was about, since the author wrote that he entered the girl's quarters for the first time, and that what happened between him and the beauty worried him greatly. Later, someone addressed our hero directly, saying that he would definitely cope, and, even if he lost one battle, he would not lose the war. With each new line, the young man became more and more surprised, but what struck him most was that, judging by the diary, he was the criminal who insulted the girls. Unwilling to believe all of this, Wu Jin quickly and angrily threw the notebook onto the floor, still not believing what was happening. With hatred in his voice, our hero shouted that he urgently needed to commit harakiri as soon as possible, instead of doing what he was apparently doing. The young man tried to collect his thoughts for a moment, and then became angry again at the developers who had come up with such nonsense. The diary was still lying on the floor, and the guy, turning to the large painting, was wondering what to do next. Wu Jin turned around and decided that the only way out was to pack his things, retreat, and hide for a while to wait for everything to calm down. After some time, our hero's backpack was ready, and it seemed he was about to set off on his journey, saying goodbye forever to his new friends. However, the next second he heard a strange voice telling him that someone knew who the criminal was. Turning around, our hero realized that the voice did not belong to a person, but to a large parrot, which was shouting something absurd over and over again. The angry man did not understand where the bird came from, and so he decided to do everything to drive it away. Standing outside, Wu Jin wondered where the parrot could have flown off to, knowing that he couldn't keep silent about what he had heard from a few moments ago. Watching the bird fly, the young man weighed all the options and still decided that this parrot would head towards Qin Shui. Thinking out loud, the young man decided that at any cost he had to meet the bird face to face, and then he remembered the pipe and medicines lying in his backpack and decided that this was not without reason. The street was quiet and peaceful. The starry sky beckoned with its beauty, and the moon evoked a feeling of romance and peace. The scent of incense and steam wafted through the bathroom, indicating that someone had been there. That person was Qian, who was sitting in a large wooden bathtub, enjoying the nice and relaxing warm water that she so desperately needed. After wiping herself with a small cloth, the girl noticed someone ahead and was surprised because she didn't understand who it could be. However, the next moment a large parrot appeared in front of her, who informed the beauty that he had a very important matter for her. Having flown into the bathroom, the bird noticed that the girl was taking a bath, but again decided to pass it off as a fact. It was clear from the brunette's expression that she was a little embarrassed, although she understood that an ordinary parrot had flown into the room. However, a second later, the girl noticed that the bird was behaving indecently, and after making a few movements, she did the impossible. The bandage hanging from the bird's neck instantly turned into something like a straight ribbon wrapped around the parrot's body. Looking at the bird, the girl said with anger in her voice that it was irritating her more and more every day. The beauty also noted that she doesn't devote time to training and spends her days spying on naked girls. Wu Jin, who was sitting on the roof, heard the girl ask a rhetorical question about whether he was of any use to anyone, and he was convinced that she was addressing him specifically. The next minute, our hero covered his face with his hands in horror, realizing that his problems were growing much faster than he could solve them. The young man narrowed his eyes and thought that he had no other choice, so he should act as quickly as possible. A second later, the guy had in his hands the same cigarette that he had found just recently. As Wu Jin continued to lie on the roof and smoke, he looked out the small window next to him. At that very moment, our heroine finished taking a bath, went out, and began to dry herself with a towel when she heard some noise. The young man, observing this entire scene, gazed at the beauty with amazement, unable to tear his eyes away from it. He was so engrossed that he did not notice how he began to make sounds. Qin Shui heard some strange sounds, so the beauty narrowed her eyes and asked in a gloomy voice who was in the room. The girl quickly wrapped herself in a robe, realizing that she was most likely not alone, so it was better to take care of such an intimate situation in advance. But the next moment something indescribable happened. Our hero, having fallen from the roof, found himself in a basin of water. Looking at the young man, our heroine calmly asked him why he was not sleeping at such a late hour and why he had climbed onto the roof of her house. Wu Jin stuttered and blushed as he began to justify himself, explaining that on such a beautiful night he wanted to admire the moon and stars, but his rooftop did not have such a beautiful view as hers. The girl crossed her arms over her chest and asked the guy in a more angry tone how it was that he was admiring such a beautiful sky, but at the same time was looking out the window on the roof. Closing his eyes and smiling, the young man answered without any embarrassment that the moonlight was so beautiful that he would like to show it to the beauty. Qin Shui didn't seem to be listening to his lies, but the cigar in his hand interested her much more, so she asked him directly what it was. Realizing that the girl had not missed this detail, the young man began to stutter and say something, but it was clear that he was having a hard time coming up with an excuse. However, the very next second, stepping back, our hero answered differently, saying that this pipe allows him to relax. And, looking into the girl's big eyes, he continued, noting that he had recently bought this thing in a mountain village. However, completely unexpectedly for himself, the young man heard the girl, without any doubt, ask him to treat her to this wonderful cigar. Realizing that the beauty had taken him by surprise, Wu Jin seemed to hand over the phone, explaining that he had already managed to relax. A second later, he added that the cigar was very good, and he didn't even think that he would like it so much. And in order to somehow reinforce his words, he lit a cigarette and began to smoke in the presence of a young girl, looking at her attentively. Although at the same time, The young man thought that he found himself in an extremely unpleasant situation and did not understand when it would finally end, because a lot of time had already passed. Having entered this state, the young man took another drag, becoming more and more absorbed in his own thoughts. He became so engrossed that, after a couple of seconds, he began to release not just steam, but smoke rings. Not knowing what else to say to the girl, he tried to draw her attention to this very thing, asking if she had managed to look at the rings. But literally a minute later, the young man's condition changed because he began to say goodbye, telling the beauty that she needed a good night's sleep, as this would allow her to maintain excellent health. And, laughing loudly, he added that there was no need to accompany him, because he could easily find the exit himself. But our hero found a way out in a rather unusual way. He tripped over a small ledge, got stuck, and fell face down. Qian looked at the young man in surprise, not understanding what was happening to him, but also not wanting to understand the situation or tell him anything. And he, continuing to crawl out, thought to himself that there was something very strange mixed in the tobacco, something he had never tried before. Before the young man had time to disappear from sight, the girl's attention was drawn to the very secret blue notebook that he had carefully hidden. Leaning towards the notebook, the girl froze for a moment, as if considering whether she should read it or not. For a moment there was silence in the room. The young man could no longer speak, and the girl was busy with her own affairs. And that something was reading the diary, which with each passing minute captivated our heroine more and more. As for Wu Jin, lying on the floor with his eyes wide open, he thought that this time the beauty was getting points because he had been defeated. After some time, a voice was heard in the room, which, turning to someone, asked his last name and first name, but instead of an answer, heard an indistinct muttering. Trying to open his eyes, the man could barely make out the teacher sitting in front of him, who was holding something that looked like a pipe in his hands. And the teacher, continuing to ask questions, now became interested in his age, hearing the number 3 in response. The parrot, hanging on a rope, recovered and said that he was not 3, but 3 years and 30 months old. With a sly look, the teacher asked the bird what it had done that it was now right in front of his eyes. The parrot ruffled his feathers, and then began to say from afar that he had done nothing of the sort, and after a short silence added that he had simply been watching a beautiful girl in the bathhouse for a while. Apparently, the owner was delighted with this answer, because, after thinking for a moment, he noticed that this was not the first time the bird had done something like this. A minute later he added that as punishment he would pluck 3 feathers from a bird, thinking to himself that he could get good money for the feathers of such a purebred bird. The next moment, the teacher grabbed the parrot by the tail and began plucking its feathers, while simultaneously trying to finish what he started and calm the bird down. After a minute, it seemed that the parrot had very few feathers left, and realizing this, the teacher insisted on smearing the bird's tail with ginger root to speed up the growth of feathers. Jean, standing behind the old man, also watched everything that was happening, thinking that he probably already knew everything, and therefore there was no point in expecting mercy. Noticing the young man, the teacher began to insult him, noting that he had finally come to his senses. And he, being tied up, did not understand what was happening, how he ended up in this room, and why the teacher was looking at him with such glee. Holding the same blue notebook in his hands, the man walked closer to our hero and angrily whispered that he couldn't even imagine that he would have the chance to teach this guy a lesson so soon. Realizing that he wouldn't get away with it, the young man tried to justify himself by pointing out one big misunderstanding. But the teacher didn't seem to listen to our hero, telling him that the teacher had a kind and bright heart. And then he's quick to remind you that the guy got into a fight the night before, that he either got drunk or took drugs the night before, and that he found a hiding place even earlier, and that he got away with it all very easily. Looking menacingly into Wu Jinyu's eyes, he continued that things were different now, because spying on girls in the bathhouse was a special crime for which the young man should be punished. Coming as close to our hero as possible, the teacher began to say that he was using his official position to solve personal problems, which greatly angered the teacher. And then, grabbing him by the arms, he continued threateningly, saying that the young man should not be surprised by anything, and advised him to become a good person at least in the next life, not noticing how the young man kicked his legs in protest. Seeing that the teacher had taken the boy outside, he began to shout even louder, calling for someone, but from time to time he continued to ask the teacher if he really had nothing better to do than serve his punishment. This conversation might have gone on for a very long time if it weren't for Qian Shui, whom the men stumbled upon in the courtyard, and who ordered the teacher to let the boy go. Having thrown the young man to the floor, the owner, scratching the back of his head, asked the girl what had happened and why she was in the yard. In the next moment, realizing that salvation was so close, Wu Jin screamed, turned to the beauty, and begged her to save him from the evil old man. Continuing to stare at the owner, The girl did not take her eyes off him and again asked him directly what happened between him and this guy. But he tried in every way to avoid answering, starting to argue that any self-respecting teacher should thoroughly clarify the whole essence of the question. And if that's the case, the older man wants to personally escort this inappropriate young man into the courtroom. The older man narrowed his eyes and asked rhetorically where it would be best to exile Wu Jin for all his crimes and bad treatment of young girls. The next minute, the girl spoke up and suggested sending the boy to the Wang family, adding that many said that this family was the richest, which meant that they too would be able to receive a reward for the young man. Hearing the word money, the master's eyes lit up, and he immediately thought that the reward would probably be more than 1,000 rare spirit coins. However, turning his gaze to the disgruntled girl, the old man realized that he had said everything out loud, and now he needed to somehow retreat so as not to look like such a fool in front of the beauty. And so the very next minute the owner began to say that you can't earn all the money. Its value is insignificant. Purity of soul is important to him. So he does everything for the sake of justice. The girl still stood motionless at the gate, and it seemed that the teacher's words had no effect on her. Perhaps this conversation could have continued, but it was interrupted by a loud knock on the gate and a voice demanding that the owner leave. Chi-do and several other brothers stood outside the gate, shouting to the teacher that Sister Chen wanted to see him. They also saw Nan Ma, from whom he had borrowed money but still hadn't repaid it. Hearing this, the owner turned to the beauty and asked her to tell the guys that he was not at home, so that they would not knock in vain. A few minutes later, Chi-do reported to the plump girl that the teacher was not at home, and she only cried and said that this man was very cunning and resourceful. And then she added that when the young man saw the owner, she told him that if he did not return and repay the debt soon, she would beat him. Once they were together again, Qian Shui turned to the teacher and angrily asked him if it was right to drink in the name of justice. The owner wanted to say something, but the next second he began to stutter and then suddenly shouted out the word baby. As strange as it may sound, the same teacher fell to his knees in front of the girl, grabbed the beauty by the leg, and began to ask the old man for help, since he really needed money. He cried and sobbed, saying that everyone would be told that she had done this only for the sake of her master, who would not last even a couple of days in such a deplorable situation. The man clearly hinted at money, and then continued by saying that they could hand over Wu Jin and receive a reward for him, as they had originally planned. The young man, listening attentively to the conversation, could not believe his ears, because the old man continued to remark that he himself would miss the young man very much. And he, without the slightest embarrassment, said that the owner looked as pathetic and worthless as possible. A minute later, the beauty freed our hero from the tightly bound ropes and told the teacher that one cannot simply take and replace a person, especially one's own student. But the teacher insisted, noting that the girl needed money for the 1,000-year-old herb Scarlet Flame. Otherwise, she would not get rid of the disease. He also added that if they sent the young man to the Wang family, they would solve all financial problems and allow the girl to finally regain her long-awaited health. A moment later, the teacher turned his attention to Wu Jin, turning to him and wondering if he really didn't want to watch the girl disappear and turn into an ice sculpture due to a lack of money for medicine. However, it seemed the young man did not listen to him, because he turned away from the man with a businesslike air and looked into the distance, only occasionally grinning. However, a minute later, while adjusting his belt, the guy noticed that the 1,000 coins they gave him for his head was nothing, since he could have earned 10 times more. These words angered the teacher, who reminded him that 1,000 rare spirit coins would be enough for 20 years of comfortable life for the entire clan, but the young man did not understand this and was talking nonsense. The old man did not give up and continued to convince the girl that she needed to get rid of this guy because he was useless in the Wang family. At best, he would be made a eunuch, but this was not life-threatening at all. While the young man was trying to justify himself somehow, Qian Shui decided to end the conversation, declaring that she would not give him away anywhere because she had her own reasons for doing so. As he left the courtyard, the teacher muttered under his breath that this guy had no responsibility, no heroic spirit, no self-sacrifice. In a word, the old man's whole plan had failed. The only happy one was Wu Jin, who, smiling, continued to thank the beauty, saying that she was his savior. He was about to say something else, but the next minute the girl returned the notebook to him, ordering the guy to hide it well and not stick his head out of the house, otherwise no one would help him. And then, with severity in her voice, she added that if she found out that this guy had harmed even one girl, she would no longer put up with him and would kill him herself. Placing his right hand over his heart, the boy promised that if no one touched him, then he himself would not be the first to intervene. If the girl believed this explanation, then the young man's parrot could not be fooled, because the bird quickly made a sign that said liar. Upon entering the gate, Qian Shui noted that she would help him sort out this whole misunderstanding, but he should not stay on the sidelines. Seeing the beauty, the young man was puzzled by what she was talking about and decided to ask the girl again what she meant. Turning to the brunette, he asked if she really needed the 1,000-year-old scarlet flame herb that her clan was hunting for. Continuing to pace the yard, the girl sternly remarked that the young man should not interfere in her affairs. But the young man insisted he wanted to thank her somehow, so he said that from now on, and hesitated for a second. Then he took a deep breath and continued, saying that he owed the beauty a huge debt and would therefore help her solve any problems. And this was absolutely true. It was a pleasant, warm evening outside. A bright moon was shining, and a large local cat was running across the roof. At that moment, Wu Jin was lying on the bed in the room, carefully studying his notes and saying out loud that he had become involved in an exciting game. He learned that the Tianyuan continent was divided into 9 parts, which marked the beginning of the Taxia dynasty, where elections were held in a special way, and the winner was the one who won the competition. The guy realized that all items in the game are divided into skills, potions, equipment, and accessories, and the latter, in turn, are also divided into 3 types: basic, rare, and legendary. Next, we talked about the chakras. The book said that each of them, in turn, is divided into 9 branches, which in turn are divided into degrees of usefulness and can lead the soul to the dark side. The young man believed that he could easily change the aura of his character, which is certainly what he wanted. Putting one of the notebooks aside, the young man continued to mutter out loud that he found it hard to imagine what kind of womanizer the guy described in the book was. Having begun to study the other notebook with the same care, our hero noticed that in this one, unlike the others, several pages were missing. Leafing through the notebook, he noticed that they had been torn out in the most careless manner, indicating the obvious haste of whoever had done it. On one side was a text that shocked him. It explained why the order to catch the criminal had been given to his sister and whether there was any copycat, and below it was a statement that this needed to be found out. Wu Jin looked at the book in surprise, thinking that the girl should most likely catch him herself. But were there any other outside observers in the city? Closing the book, he confidently declared that none of this mattered at all, and whoever the author of this notebook was would show him what real cruelty was. In the very next minute, having settled comfortably in bed, the guy decided that tomorrow he absolutely had to earn as many experience points as possible. Only a few minutes passed, and our hero was already fast asleep, snoring. This was not surprising, since it was the middle of the night outside. Getting up as early as possible, Chi-Du hurried to open the gate, as if letting everyone know that the morning was in full swing and it was time to wake up. This noise did not escape our hero, despite having wrapped his head in a blanket, still heard the rumble of the metal gate. The very next minute, Chi-Du knocked on his door, informing him that the auction was about to begin, which meant that there was less and less time left to prepare. Sitting on the bed, Wu Jin thought that there would be a lot of people at the auction, which meant that he would have a unique opportunity to get experience points very easily and quickly. At that moment, 2 strangers were talking at the other end of the courtyard. One of them said that the young princess's people had already arrived, but had disappeared somewhere, although everyone knew them, despite the fact that they had no official territory on Kyushu. The maid of Queen Xin Yan's daughter asked the man whether the daughter of the king of Yongzhou was really more respectable than the daughter of her Wang family, to which he nodded in the affirmative. The next moment the conversation was interrupted by the same parrot, who screamed loudly and began to swear. However, this did not last long, because after just a minute the girl did everything possible to catch this bird. Holding the parrot in her hands, the beauty screamed, explaining to the bird that it dared to humiliate her right in the middle of the street in front of everyone. At that moment, a man approached the evil beauty from behind and said that the bird's owner did not respect their union, and therefore had every right to punish the parrot. The Wang family representative continued to scream, wondering who this creepy bird belonged to. It turned out that those gathered either did not listen to her or did not want to object to the girl, so as not to get into trouble. The next moment she screamed, demanding that the bird be completely plucked and roasted. Further action was avoided thanks to Chi-Du and Wu Jin, who began to calm the beauty, telling her to release the bird, which was not guilty of anything. Looking at the guys standing on their swords, the girl noticed that they were Lin Wu Zun's disciples, but she had no idea that even they possessed such a skill, because using this skill requires opening the 4th flame chakra. Realizing this, the assistant of the Wang family representative once again confirmed to herself, not believing that these guys were really Lin Wu Zun's disciples. It seemed that this whole story only amused our hero, who, with a smile in his eyes, emphasized to himself that he had managed to earn extra points by frightening and surprising everyone gathered. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, Chi-do turned to Wu Jin and declared that they had finally arrived at the destination, which meant they could go out and rest. Having descended to the ground, the young man told our hero that he was very tired from flying on the sword and asked if there was another way to get to his destination. While fanning himself, Wu Jin noted that if a person wants to achieve spiritual perfection, then flying with a sword should become a normal thing for him. Looking at the guys, Qin Yin was clearly unhappy with everything that had happened, but she didn't know what to say or answer. While Chi-do was fiddling with the swords and complaining about their heavy weight, our hero showered Qian Shui with compliments, noting that even after the flight, the girl's hairstyle had not changed at all and remained just as beautiful. However, the very next moment the young man realized that his compliment had sounded unconvincing and, turning to himself, said that next time he would have to try harder. The Wang family representative, still holding the bird in his hands, turned to Wu Jin and asked if he had really ordered the bird to humiliate the girl. It was clear that the young man did not want to participate in all of this, but Qian Shui turned to him and told him not to even try to avoid the conflict. Clenching his fist, he thought for a moment and, as usual, remained silent, carefully considering his next steps. In the very next moment, still holding the fan in his hands, he noticed that there had been a small misunderstanding, and the girl had misunderstood everything. Continuing, the young man noted that, in truth, the chick had one superpower, but without finishing his sentence, he fell silent again. He then noted that the bird was able to recognize the powerful qi and blood circulation in the human body. The more noble a person was, the better his blood circulation was, and the stronger the qi, the more stable his spiritual body was. Without missing a beat, he added that the bird had suffered a traumatic brain injury as a child, so she has problems with personal space, and he chose the girl because she is an outstanding person and of noble origin. At that moment, the parrot began to speak and seemed to start calculating some formulas to show that everything was actually okay with him. Realizing that the young man was openly mocking her, the girl asked him if he really thought she would believe all the nonsense he had just told her. The servant standing nearby shouted, turned to the boy, and told him not to even try to justify himself, because their family had always shown disrespect to the Wang clan. Qian Shui, who witnessed the conversation, clearly didn't understand what was going on, but she didn't intend to intervene or say anything. And then the maid, turning to her mistress, said that she must certainly take action. Such insolence was unforgivable, because if this happened, the family's reputation would suffer. Not understanding who this man was who kept interfering and pointing things out to the girl, Wu Jin asked him who he was. The young man didn't have time to answer, but Chi-do intervened in the conversation and explained that it was the second ruler of the Daoyao clan, Su Xan, Xiaoyao Min, and the Zhu family who had always wanted to take them over by force. And, continuing to hear that this happened not only thanks to Qian Shui, the guy already thought that in just 5 minutes he became a villain, although he did not deserve it. Chi-do continued by saying that the original owner of these bracelets was Lord Yinzhou, but due to the struggle for the royal throne, their families fell into decline and they eventually moved away. And while Wu Jing was looking at the second gentleman, he noticed that, according to Xiaoyao Manya himself, their family came from ancient China and the blood of the mythical animal Huang flows in their veins. After listening attentively to Chi-do, our hero turned to Su Xian and asked the guy if he had looked at himself in the mirror, and if he had no taste, then the young man would definitely help him tidy himself up. With a serious expression, he continued that he was offering a completely ridiculous price of 20 spiritual coins, and that there would also be a 20% discount when registering for the card. The guy listening to our hero didn't understand what he was talking about, so he adjusted his glasses tighter and told him to stop talking nonsense and to leave quickly. However, Wu Jin did not calm down and this time decided to change the subject to the lady, declaring that he was primarily interested in his sister, and then he would definitely return and help the young man with his image. The astonished representative of the Wang family, who had been silent all this time, suddenly intervened in the conversation and asked the guy what he meant. The next second, a red box appeared in the young man's hands, on which the names Yang and Lin were engraved. The girl didn't seem to be moved by this at all, so she began to ask the guy if he really thought that she, who grew up in the Wang family and had a lot of influence in the trade union, would believe such a thing. But it seemed like this guy knew what he was talking about, because he turned to the beauty and said that maybe she would believe him when she saw what was inside the box. The next minute, the girl's eyes widened in surprise. It became clear that she had no idea that she could end up here. Therefore, she turned to Su Xing and asked him to leave, saying that Wu Jin was someone who did not lie. This turn of events clearly did not suit him, because, approaching the girl, he said that she could not just leave and spare the young man. The next moment, the Wang family representative addressed everyone present and said that this might be the end of it, but everyone should remember that if this happened again, there would be no more mercy from them. Addressing our hero directly, the girl warned him that, upon seeing the young princess, he should keep a close eye on the bird and not create problems for others. The guy, looking pleased, confirmed as he left that everything would be exactly like that, and the girl looked at her box with such anticipation and joy. Finally, Wu Jin turned to Su Xing and said that he had disappointed him, but he would try better next time. Looking at Qian Shui's sad expression, the boy wondered if she was really interested in what was in the box, but received a negative answer. But it was clear that this interested Qi Du, with a sparkle in his eyes, asked what our hero had presented to the clan representative. After enduring a moment of curiosity, the young man replied that it was a very ordinary blush. Meanwhile, Qi Du, noting how cool Wu Jin was, added that women could never resist good cosmetics. Seeing Qian Shui quickly leaving, the young man decided to stop her and do something to please her. So a minute later, he was already holding an open red box in front of her and asking the girl not to be jealous, since he had prepared something much better and more interesting for her. The young man hoped that the beauty would like his gift, but the girl, with the same indifference, replied that she didn't care. Not understanding what he had said or done wrong, with an upset look and sadness in his eyes, the guy said that he would give this gift to someone else. It seemed that the beauty's heart melted, because after his words the girl turned around, walked up to him, and touched the box with her hand. Quickly taking the item from the guy, she noted that she would take it, but only with the best of intentions so that the young man would not do it again. With a smile in his eyes, Wu Jin thought that, after all, girls were amazing creatures and, as always, remained a mystery. Noticing that Qian Shui was not in the best mood, Qi Du asked if she really felt unwell, but our hero quickly fell silent. Indeed, the very next moment, the young man turned his attention to Wu Jin, informing him that the Zhu family was somehow connected to him. In turn, he was asked what kind of relationship the young man currently has with the Xiaoyao, Meng, and Zhu families. A minute later, Qi Du began to explain that even in his childhood, the Zhu family had entered into a marriage contract according to which our hero was engaged to their eldest daughter, and he fell silent for a moment. However, the boy didn't have time to finish because Wu Jin interrupted him, adding that in the end they saw what he had become and suddenly refused, which Qi Du himself confirmed. He suggested that our hero was regaining his memory, but Wu Jin, with a smile on his face, declared that this was not the case. He then added that this was just a new plot twist that he liked because after a while this family would burst into tears, kneel before him, and beg him to make things right. The young man could have continued his story, but the next moment a cloud of smoke rose, and someone shouted very loudly for everyone gathered to step aside. Qian Shui, having listened attentively to the brothers' conversation, decided to intervene and, turning to Wu Jin, said that his fiancée had arrived and was going to fight hysterically to restore the agreement. After these words, the young man's face changed dramatically, and he said that he had some kind of bad feeling. And this did not let him down at all, because a minute later a huge boar appeared on the road, which was difficult to stop. And indeed, he looked as terrifying as possible. Not only was he wearing some kind of green robe, but thick steam was pouring out of his nose. The next minute, one of the beauties, running along the road and escaping from the enraged beast, tripped over a stone and screamed. Seeing everything that was happening, the red-haired beauty who controlled this beast could do nothing and watched with horror in her eyes as the boar destroyed everything in its path. She realized that the animal was too strong and clumsy, and that it had also reached its maximum speed, so it was now difficult for it to brake sharply. Our hero, watching what was happening with surprise, thought for a moment, pondering his next steps. Similar thoughts probably crossed Qian Shui's mind as well, and she also didn't understand what could be done in this situation. The situation was getting more and more tense with each passing minute, and was made worse by the fact that a strange child was sitting nearby, in the middle of the road, not understanding what to expect. However, the next minute a young man ran up to the beast, cut off its path, and accomplished the almost impossible, forcing it to freeze. This man turned out to be Master Su Ge, who asked the frightened girl, who had been sitting on the road just a second ago, how she felt. This question was also asked of the child by the eldest daughter of the Zhu family, whose name was Zhu Baiyu, who kept apologizing to everyone gathered, blaming herself for what happened. Su Ge, deciding that the girl had also suffered in this story, decided to cheer her up a little, but at the same time noted that she was treating her beast too softly. The man noted that the boar possessed incredible strength, so he could easily keep it under control. The very next second, Su Ge caused the beast to fall exactly in the same place where it had stood a minute ago, which left everyone gathered in slight shock. Looking around, Zhu Baiyu thanked the young man again and again for his brave act. For some time, some of those gathered continued to blame themselves, but at the same time spoke flatteringly of their savior. He suddenly looked at Qian Shui and abruptly stated that their clan had little time left, as more than 6 months had passed since the last meeting, and the beauty remained at the same level. While the girl made it clear to the young man that it was none of his business, our hero, turning his back on the beauty, was clearly planning an escape. It seemed like he would succeed, because at that moment everyone was busy with their own affairs, but the next moment someone's hand boldly grabbed him by the collar, asking where he was going. It was Qian Shui, who curiously asked where the young man was heading because he was going to force the Zhu family to lie at his feet. But he, not noticing that others were looking at him, began to justify himself and say that he had changed his mind and, moreover, was grateful to the clan for terminating the marriage contract. The young man was so carried away that he didn't notice how a familiar voice addressed him by name. It was Zhu Baiyu who, after asking rhetorically whether he was waiting for her again, quickly added that this guy should stop pestering her because their union was impossible. Then, turning to Su Ge, she added that they had announced their engagement a couple of days ago, and in turn advised Wu Jing to stop thinking about her, dreaming about her, and especially pestering her. After a few seconds, she sharply pointed out that comparing him and Su Ge was like comparing a firefly's belly to the moonlight. That is, they were heaven and earth. The young man continued to stand and explain, doing everything possible to ensure that no one would guess his true feelings and plans. In the next moment, closing his eyes and clasping his head in his hands, he thanked everyone for the wedding and said that he was already thinking about becoming a monk. This picture clearly did not please the girl from the Zhu family, who frowned, not understanding what was happening. To change the topic, Su Ge sarcastically turned to Qian Shui, casually asked how she was doing, and stated that if she didn't find the right plant, she would die, but nothing bad would happen since the Zhu family would be happy to annex her clan. Smiling and supporting the groom, Zhu Baiyu added that he had promised to give her the 1,000-year-old herb of this tribe, which she liked so much, as a wedding gift. Then, turning her gaze to Wu Jin, she advised him to look for a free place in the cemetery for his sister instead of idleness. Despite all the anger with which this was said, the guy did not take offense at all, and, standing with his back turned, added that he liked the idea of choosing Su Ge as the groom. Then he noticed that if the 1,000-year-old scarlet flame herb was to be used as a wedding gift, he paused for a moment, as if choosing the right words. The next moment, the young man quickly added that in this case, he was afraid that their marriage would simply not take place. Not wanting to continue this unpleasant conversation, he glanced at Qian Shui, turned to her, and said that it was time for them to leave. Without waiting for the girl's answer, our hero simply grabbed her hand tightly and led her away. Continuing to guide the beauty through everything else, the young man fooled around, parodying Su Ge and the representative of the Zhu clan, wanting to somehow cheer up Qian Shui, who listened to him with pleasure. The young man and woman didn't hear the red-haired woman with the body of a man, that is, Zhu Baiyu, shouting after them that their beggar clan had failed to obtain the rare herb at the auction. At that time, Su Ge noticed that this family looked completely different from before, and he had the impression that they had changed. The next moment, Su Xing, who approached the young man, calmly stated that everything was ready. Zhu Baiyu crossed her arms over her chest and noted that she was already tired of waiting and her patience was running out. The girl seemed about to say something else, but Su Xing intervened and quickly thanked his brother for his hard work. True, he didn't like these words at all. On the contrary, they angered him, so he ordered Su Xing not to say that anymore, since it sounded as terrible as possible. Standing under the awning, Wu Jin asked Qian Shui if it was true that she didn't expect what happened just a few minutes ago in the courtyard. Looking at the sad girl and lowering his head, our hero noticed that he was acting like a real man from a movie, and this should be cool. However, instead of joy or any other pleasant emotions, the girl expressed her opinion, adding that the guy was talking complete nonsense again. Although Chi Du, who was present during the conversation, had a different opinion on the matter. So, walking down the corridor with the young man, he praised him and said he was as calm as ever. The fat man noticed that it was the young master himself, but the guy was not afraid of him. Besides, he was from the Zhu family, which says a lot. Wu Jin, flattered by this remark, told Chi Du not to worry as he had everything under control and had brought something deadly with him, just in case. The very next second, a large cube began to rotate above his index finger, which our hero introduced as the mystery box. The conversation might have continued, but the very next minute a man entered the room and announced that the auction would soon begin, which meant that everyone needed to go up to the second floor. Seeing a few seats up front, our hero asked who they were for. It turned out that the first and second floors were specifically separated, allowing arriving guests to choose where to sit. With a smile on his face, he announced that they would sit on the first floor, despite the fact that there were a lot of people wanting to take these seats. A moment later, as he walked down the steps, the young man thought that in life you need to talk less and do more. Only then can you achieve something. After carefully surveying the hall, the man asked one of the organizers where the Zhu family would be sitting. The man, waving his hand somewhere upward, noted that at the request of the head of the family, the members of the delegation were accommodated in Tianzi's room. Having settled himself more comfortably in the chair, the man happily announced that they had agreed and would sit where he sat. However, this clearly did not please Chi-Du, who, sitting next to Wu Jin, remarked that the rival family would look down on them all, and this was very bad. The young man explained with a smile that he wanted the Zhu family to get a better look at his handsome face, because it would have a great impact on his reputation in the future. After making sure the guys were satisfied, the organizer apologized and informed everyone that he was leaving the event, and then wished them successful trading. At this time, a red-haired girl with a masculine appearance was standing in the corridor on the top floor. She turned to Su-Ge and remarked that he was probably very tired and should see a doctor for a checkup while he had the chance. With a smile on her face, she added that the best and most effective massage could help him now. However, Bai didn't have time to finish because Su Xing interrupted the conversation, turning to Su-Ge and noticing that this was the room for the young princess. And then he added that only people from the Lingwu Zone clan should be here and no one else. Entering the room and carefully examining the box standing nearby, the young man was perplexed as to where the clan was, since they should have arrived here much earlier. The next moment, the boy's eyes widened in surprise because someone turned towards him and shouted, "Su-Ku." Wu Jin stood below, shouting that if the guy wanted to change his image, he should definitely go to our hero for a hair wash, haircut, and blow-dry, and he would only charge 20 spirit coins. This statement greatly angered the young man, standing on the balcony, who shouted in anger that his name was Su Xing and that he should not be laughed at. Su-Ge, who was standing nearby and did not understand what Su-Ku meant, asked Su Xing about it. But he timidly replied that he himself did not know, although he thought that it was about something unpleasant or offensive. Shifting the conversation to Wu Jin, Su Xing added that the space on the first floor would not help them acquire the 1,000-year-old scarlet firegrass, so he wished them a pleasant time at the auction. And he, smiling and continuing to fan himself, added that before buying something, one should not forget to carefully examine the product. Su-Ge, deciding that his time was more valuable, turned to Lady Zhu and asked if the spirit coins were ready. Smiling, she told him not to worry as she would buy him whatever he wanted, so he needed to relax, and to make the guy think less, she offered him a snack of nuts. Not wanting to upset the girl, the young man said that he had eaten his fill and now did not want anything because he was very excited. A similar conversation ensued between Wu Jin and Qian Shui, who asked the beauty if she trusted him, although the girl did not understand what the young man was going to do. The young man enthusiastically explained that if the girl gave him spiritual coins, he would be able to control everything that happened at the auction, and after a little hesitation, he added that he promised to get the necessary herb for the beauty. With sadness in her eyes and a detached expression, our heroine handed the young man a large plastic card. Despite all that was said, it turned out that the young man did not believe his eyes, because with surprise in his voice he asked if the beauty really trusted him, not knowing exactly what he was going to do. Qian Shui noted that this young man was a member of her family, and if that was the case, then who could she trust if not him and his brothers? Turning to Wu Jin, she added that the young princess had come to the auction to buy the 1,000-year-old scarlet firegrass, so the young man's chances were very slim. Holding up the card, the young man declared with confidence in his voice that no matter who he had to fight, even with the princess, she would not get anything. It said, "Tang Jijia," and another unknown young man turned to the administrator and said that he needed to start as soon as possible. This man turned out to be the young princess's seventh bodyguard, Lu Changjiao, who added that the girl was eagerly awaiting his return, so he did not want to leave her to languish alone. The next minute, two organizers appeared in the arena of the hall, one of whom was holding an object wrapped in red cloth. His colleague coughed, as if calling on everyone present to pay attention to him and be silent. The very next second, the man loudly announced to everyone that the auction was officially open, and, showing an object covered with red cloth, he said that the first batch was being presented to everyone present. He added that it was brought from the forest of 10,000 demons in Agarwood Grove, where Qin Wan lived. The assembled people froze in surprise, noticing the wonderful aroma emanating from the plant hidden under the blanket. Su-Ge turned to his girlfriend and remarked that agarwood with the scent of Qin Wan was very rare, ignoring the fact that the starting price of the item was 10 medium-grade spirit coins. Su Xing, without waiting for anyone to get ahead of him, immediately took the card with the word promotion. A representative of the Zhu family said that he wanted to buy the box to give it to his beloved wife for her birthday this year. Lu Qian also dreamed of the box, and he, sitting in the next box, remarked that it was such a rare thing that the young princess must definitely get it, and if that happened, he would raise the price tenfold. Continuing to apply lipstick, which is quite unusual for a man, he held up a sign that said promotion, informing everyone that he was willing to pay 100 spirit coins for the product. Su Xing, without taking his eyes off the auction for a moment, could not believe his eyes because the price was very high. But what happened the next second shocked everyone present, because someone shouted from that place that he was ready to give 1,000 spiritual coins for the tree. Hearing such a price, Lu Qian missed, and the lipstick hit his cheek, ruining the entire image he had created. This situation shocked Su Gu, who choked heavily on his tea in surprise, trying to somehow come to his senses. At this moment, Wu Jin, who was sitting in one of the front rows, calmly asked the others who could offer a larger amount of those thousands of coins he spoke of. It seemed like Su Gu choked for the second time, because such a bold statement came from some worthless young man. Zhu Baiyu grabbed the young man's hand in fear, not understanding what was happening and why everything was not going according to plan. With horror in her eyes, the girl asked how Su Gu was feeling, and he only squeezed out a few words, saying that nothing terrible had happened. The very next minute, the young man was already walking down the corridor, and his red-haired friend was trying to catch up with him, realizing that he was immersed in some memories. Su Gu, who was in the room, turned to Wu Jin and told him that the starting price was no less than 10 medium-grade spirit coins. Our hero, enjoying the grapes, noticed that he was able to distinguish low-quality grapes from average ones, so there was nothing to worry about. He then added that if they have money, then they should continue to follow the auction, otherwise they should leave the auction. Standing nearby, Mrs. Zhu began shouting at the young man, calling him the most obscene names and accusing him of disdainfully treating such respected people, hinting at herself and her fiancé. Apparently, he did not like her behavior because the young man began to calm the girl down, telling her that she should not worry so much because everything had already been decided in advance. Su Gu calmly pointed out that this guy most likely wanted to force them to pay more, but they shouldn't give in to his provocations because their goal was to buy the grass. Turning to his red-haired friend, he tried to explain that first the guy started swearing at the entrance, and now he was trying to inflate the prices of goods. It seemed like the girl still wanted to say something, but the next moment strong hands grabbed her palms. A second later, turning to his bride, the young man began to apologize, saying that he did not want and did not think about it, but, on the contrary, did everything possible to make her happy. A moment later, the organizer shouted out in a loud voice, 1,000 spiritual coins won. Hearing a man's voice in the distance saying 1,000 spirit coins, too, Tianzi Jiaofan asked Brother Lu if he wanted to offer his price. The young man, still the same, with lipstick smeared on his cheek, was silent, as if considering his answer and further actions. While wiping off his lipstick, he noticed that 1,000 ordinary spirit coins were equivalent to 10 years of his salary, which was a very large sum, and he didn't understand who could pay such a sum. Miss Zhu and Su Gu were sitting on the sofa, and Su Xing was standing in front of them when the organizer said, 1,000 spirit coins, 3. The next second he announced in a triumphant voice that the lot presented was considered sold. It seemed that the indignation in the room did not subside. Everyone present was actively discussing something. Someone was condemning the young man. Someone was thinking about what this money could be spent on. Only the organizers were pleased. They approached Wu Jin, congratulated him on acquiring a rare item, and asked him to go to the backyard to pay and receive the goods. However, the next minute, turning to one of the auction's founders, our hero asked to strike the hammer even louder, claiming that such a sound would lift his spirits. After the organizers fulfilled the young man's request, he turned his attention to Qian Shui, who had closed her eyes and concluded that the instrument was clearly not intended for the young lady. And then, with his characteristic humor, he began to think to himself that, judging by the size of the hammer, it weighed at least 10 kilograms. Miss Zhu clearly didn't like this large girl. However, a second later, having come to her senses, Qian Shui sharply declared, turning to Wu Jin, that she should wait a little, and then her brother, that is he, would definitely help her. Turning his gaze to the departing guy, Qi Du asked the brunette if she really believed that the young man would be able to buy back the box with a plant. With some sadness in her voice, the girl honestly admitted that she didn't know, but she was absolutely sure that the guy wouldn't harm her, and therefore she trusted him completely. And to himself, as if mentally addressing our hero, Qi Du thought that all this was just to please the beauty. She deserves happiness, so he hopes that everything will be fine. A few minutes later, Wu Jin found himself holding a small, colorful box in his hands. It seemed to be the very same precious box. Chi-do, opening his eyes in surprise, wanted to ask something, but the hero asked the guy to wait for the girl so that they could all enjoy the wonderful aroma emanating from the box. In the next minute, as if answering his sworn brother's unasked question, he said that people can only afford to live without regrets when they can afford to spend that kind of money. Even though the box was closed, the aroma of its contents continued to spread throughout the room, where those gathered continued to sit and discuss the purchase of medium-quality coins for 1,000. It seemed that there was not a single place where the delicious smell of wood did not waft. Su Xing, who also saw and understood everything, pulled his glasses tighter over his eyes, wondering when the Jin clan had such a huge amount of money. Su Gu, sitting with an arrogant expression, remarked that there were people who were quickly ruined by wealth, just by looking at Wu Jin's insolent face. But he assured everyone gathered that this was only the beginning. At that very moment, the two organizers appeared on stage again, announcing to everyone present that the second product would now be presented. The men also reported that the item on display was an unusual chamber pot that had been used by Emperor Xia himself in the previous century. Tianji Jiafan, listening carefully, thought to herself that many people were looking for various objects and devices that the emperors used, trying to get closer to solving the mystery of their disappearance. Brother Liu, who was just then beginning to highlight his eyebrows, remarked that the chamber pot was not the most decent or interesting thing, but it was still a royal heirloom that would not be shameful to give to Princess. Surprisingly, this artifact also interested Zhu Baiyu, who from the very beginning enthusiastically listened to the fascinating story about the chamber pot and happily declared that she wanted to buy it. Leaning towards Su Gu, who was drinking tea, the girl hinted at buying it, but he seemed completely uninterested, as he didn't even look up from his cup. And at that moment, the organizers announced the starting price of the artifact, which was 50 medium-quality spiritual coins. A voice in the crowd was heard shouting the word promotion, but at the same moment another voice was heard saying the number 100. For a moment, everyone froze, but only until Wu Jin laughed and announced the price of 5,000 medium-quality coins. Hearing this amount, Su Gu, who was drinking tea, choked and spat it out at Su Xing, who was standing in front of him. Brother Liu, astonished, missed, and instead of an eyebrow, he drew the pencil across his forehead, not understanding what was happening. Su Gu was also indignant, jumped up and began shouting with anger in his voice that Wu Jin did not understand what he was doing, and even more so, did not understand what he wanted to achieve with his actions. The girl sitting next to him with the man's body asked the guy to calm down and drink some tea, noting that one must fight the fire and not give in to it, as he was doing. Su Xing, stroking his forehead, suggested that we take nuts, and, as many as possible, perhaps they would help cope with anger and not tea. A mystery box with all the coolest things. The next minute he became interested in a fruit of knowledge worth 100 points that would radically change his blood. And after some time, the young man looked into the ominous eyes of a wild boar greedily eating green grass. Having brought the chamber pot to the monster's nose, our hero, turning to the boar, said that this thing was of no use to him, and if so, then he asked to borrow it. And after a short silence, he added that, being a follower of the socialist movement, he assures the animal that he will definitely return this little toy to its owner. Tianji Jiafan, who approached the guy, asked why he invited her to such a strange place to talk about finances, but the young man noted that only here they would not have unexpected listeners. And then, leaning closer to the beauty, he told her that he had rare items ready for sale, and if the bank had any offers, he would be waiting for them. After considering the young man's idea, the girl asked if he really wanted to do it, without specifying what exactly, and inquired what benefit the guy would receive from knowing that the young man had his own reasons. A minute later, the beauty said that she was absolutely happy with everything except the incomprehensible red box, because things made of such material are rarely put up for auction. But the very next moment, upon opening the box, the beauty froze in surprise, wondering where the young man got such a treasure. At this time, there were still many people in the auction room, waiting for the auction to continue and hoping for new lots. Our hero entered the hall majestically, solemnly displaying the chamber pot and thus demonstrating his superiority, while Su Xing, who was watching all this, furiously criticized the young man. In the very next minute, Wu Jin said that money is evil. How you earn it is how you spend it. And as for Su Xing, he is an incredibly petty person. And he simply replied that he was impatiently awaiting the moment when a young man would start to twitch hysterically, so he should be more modest and smarter. Continuing to fan himself with his fan, which, as always, had a beautiful inscription on it, the young man said with a malicious smile that he would wait for this moment. The conversation could have gone on for a very long time, But the next second the organizer appeared on stage, asked for silence, and announced that the next stage of the auction awaited everyone present. The man noted that all 3 items in the hands of these guys were given to guests and temporarily added to the auction lots. And according to legend, these boxes belonged to a complex of one ancient relic. He then added that since no one had ever opened these boxes, there were no mentions or records of them, and it was impossible to say exactly what was inside, so the starting price was 1 medium-grade spirit coin. A wave of bewilderment swept through the hall. Those gathered did not understand where these boxes had come from or what could be inside them. Qin Yin, returning to the room, noted that the Cusionic Chamber of Commerce and Industry would never trade at a loss, although his brother did not understand what this meant, but he said that he was sure there would be no excitement around the boxes. Su Xing, carefully examining the goods, reasoned that if the box was covered with glossy varnish or made using a special wood polishing technology, then otherwise the boxes looked quite ordinary. However, the next moment, Su Ge, who was sitting next to him, announced that he wanted to increase the amount of the plot, although he did not name a specific amount. Su Xing, noticing his brother's foresight, shouted that he also wanted to participate in the auction, so he increased the lot amount to 10 medium-quality coins. And, continuing to carefully examine Wu Jin, he turned to him with a question. If he is such a rich man, then why is he silent and not trying to raise the rate? However, he proudly stated that the best things are often finished, so he would not rush and wait a little longer. The next minute, a familiar voice came from the hall, shouting that he would give 100 medium-quality spirit coins for the box. Su Xing, realizing that it wasn't his brother who was shouting, asked him if he knew what was going on, and then quickly asked if they were going to increase the tempo even more. In a stern voice, he stated that there was no need for this, and then added that business would not be successful if a person, under the influence of emotions, was so easily succumbed to them and forced to buy unnecessary things. And at that moment, the organizer announced the quantity of 100 medium-quality spirit coins for the last time and began the countdown, informing everyone that the fight for the lot was coming to an end. The room was once again filled with puzzled conversations about how anyone could be so stupid as to buy some unknown box without knowing what was inside. But after just a minute, everyone froze, because the organizer shouted, "Sold!" The man on stage explained that due to the nature of the stage, all 3 jade boxes will be displayed on stage at the same time, and asked Wu Jin to pay for the goods. Opening the box, our hero looked inside in surprise, not understanding what was inside and why the object was so light. Su Xing, who was watching the whole thing from the balcony, was glad that the young man was making an idiot of himself. And at that moment, our hero took something out of the box that looked like fruit, but he didn't fully understand what it was. The young man's ill-wishers watched closely, believing that the box contained the original source of all fruit. The first to come to his senses was Brother Liu, who turned to Su Xing and asked him to immediately get the encyclopedia and collect all the information about the first fruits. After a short while, the young man began to tell his story, pointing out that it was a magical fruit that changed history by purifying the bloodline, and whoever ate this berry would receive a purer and richer bloodline. Jumping up from his seat, the boy shouted from the balcony, turning to Wu Jin and asking him to sell him this fruit for 500, and then, after thinking, added that he was willing to pay 1,000 medium-quality spirit coins for it. Grinning, our hero replied that if they were offering such a large sum for it, it meant that the fruit really was like that, and if that was the case, then he definitely wouldn't sell it. Su Xing didn't give up, continuing to shout from the balcony, and noting that this fruit could only improve the bloodline, but not change it completely. Then he added that the amount he had offered was negotiable, and after a moment's hesitation, he noted that the fruit was still of no use to our hero. These words didn't seem to bother Wu Jin at all, who thought that the amazing thing in the box was only useful for half-breeds. The young man seemed to have realized something, so he started shouting that he would not sell it to his competitors for either 500 coins or 5,000. At that moment, a parrot appeared out of nowhere, shouting that there was no crossbreeding in his blood, but he knew one who did, and pointing at Jubai. And then something incredible happened. The young man began to stuff the purchased fruit into the bird's mouth. Having finished quickly, he asked how the parrot was feeling and whether anything had changed in its internal sensations. Realizing that nothing was happening, the young man turned away from the bird, thinking that most likely all this was pointless, and did not notice how the parrot noticed that he was getting hot. After listening to what the bird had said, the young man added that he had, however, noticed one change. The chick had stopped stuttering, although he did not understand what our hero meant, because the parrot had never noticed anything like that. And then he continued, noting that if the parrot was really hot, then it was quite possible that it was a phoenix. Su Xing, continuing to observe what was happening below, decided to prick our hero once again. noting in front of everyone gathered that he was a fool who spent a lot of money and fed the bird useless fruits. Although the fruit seemed to be working, something really wrong began to happen to the parrot, and he felt like he was melting. And the very next minute, having soared in the air, the bird screamed louder and louder that it was getting very hot. Everyone present noticed that the sales area was getting hotter by the minute, and they complained that they had to turn off all the air conditioners to save money. Jumping up from her seat, Qin Yin began to shout loudly that the parrot had flown away and that strange things had begun to happen to it. The bird itself noticed this. Turning to its owner, it became interested in what he had done to it. Qin Shui was obviously worried about why the parrot had changed so much, so she asked Wu Jin if something bad would happen to her charge. And he, sitting next to the girl and sipping a cocktail, noticed that they had managed to cure the parrot's stuttering, although this was not the biggest problem. It seems that the most impressive thing was the transformation of the bird, which changed color, became larger and more beautiful with every minute, which was noticed by everyone around. Rising from their seats, our heroes tried to understand what was going on and why Wu Jin was not trying to intervene in this story. The little parrot we saw just a few minutes ago now seemed to have turned into one of the most beautiful phoenixes, carrying fire with it. What surprised the most was the girl, who admired either the bird or the young man, or all of them at once. Zhu Baiyu closed her eyes and quietly asked him not to do this, but it was unclear who she was talking to at that moment. However, Su Xing, who was standing next to the girl, said that there was no reason for such suspicions, and that she should relax and wait for the result. Although Su Xing himself seemed to not understand what this would lead to, he only thought that he had already seen phoenixes in foreign comics. But this bird was completely different. Brother Lu, holding tightly to the railing, also couldn't take his eyes off the bird hovering inside the building. He thought to himself that he never expected to see a ghost and all sorts of evil spirits in such a place, believing that these creatures lived elsewhere. A frightened Qin Yin, sitting on the sofa, asked the guy if he was interested in the bird, to which he only replied that this phoenix could soon turn into a beast set against its owner. And, once again immersed in his thoughts, he thought that no matter the method and no matter the sacrifice, this bird must be delivered to the palace of the young princess. Similar thoughts also occurred to Su Xing, who, glancing at Su Gu, noticed that because of Wu Jin they had missed out on such a treasure, although the interlocutor merely waved it off, saying that there were still 2 boxes ahead. The next moment, the organizer approached our hero and announced that as soon as he could resolve the problems caused by the totem animals, the auction would continue. As Wu Jin called the bird to him, he heard it remark that it finally felt an inexhaustible spiritual power within itself, and so it asked its owner to let it fly for a while. And then she added that everyone had mocked her, scolded her, and beaten her, and only now, occupying the highest position, would she be able to roast everyone alive. Qin Shui, listening carefully to the bird, calmly turned to it and told it that it could fly away and never return if it so wished. And just a few seconds later, the beautiful phoenix bird gradually transformed back into an ordinary parrot. Sitting on Qin Shui's shoulder, the parrot, like everyone else, listened to the organizer, who noted that the auction was still ongoing and the same conditions applied to the second lot with a starting price of 10 medium-quality coins. The bidding started very quickly, and the first to react was Su Xing, who shouted from his box that they were willing to give up 100 medium-grade spirit coins. Brother Lu, who was sitting in the next box, joined the auction and quickly informed everyone that he was willing to pay 500 medium-grade spirit coins for the lot. Qin Yin didn't understand why they needed this unusual fruit, and his interlocutor noted that several people of mixed blood lived in the Yongzhou Palace. Watching everything that was happening to the parrot, he noticed that, of course, the purer the phoenix's blood, the better. However, the next moment the fight for the lot resumed, and this time Su Gu announced his price of 1,000 medium-quality spirit coins. Picking up the promotional card, Brother Lu thought that the Zhu clan seemed to have truly decided to equalize its financial strength with the Yongzhou Palace. And the next moment, deciding to stun everyone present, the young man raised the bet again, which was already 2,000. Su Xing advised Su Gu to give this box to him to see what was in it, while fearing that his rivals would buy a third one, but calmly noted that their main goal was the 1,000-year-old scarlet flame grass. The next moment, after counting to 3, the organizer joyfully announced that the auction for the lot was over, since it had been sold. Taking his fruit, Brother Lu was jubilant, noting that the auction had provided them with a whole bunch of rare and interesting goods. At this moment, Su Xing shouted loudly, turning to Su Gu and showing him something, but the young man seemed to be lost in his thoughts and did not notice anything or anyone. And one could not help but notice Wu Jin, who remarked with a joyful exclamation that just because someone won the battle did not mean they would lose the war, and then added that thanks to their furious bargaining, he could estimate the amount that would remain in their hands. The organizers, who took the stage, continued by stating that the rules for the third jade box would not change, and the starting price was 10 medium-quality coins. The very next moment, someone's hand raised an advertising poster and a cry rang out that he wanted to offer 1,000 medium-quality spirit coins. Su Xing, realizing that the fruit belonged to Wu Jin, became furious at this behavior and began shouting, "Why would anyone want another rare fruit when his bird has already eaten its fill?" Turning to Qin Yin, he asked her how much money they still had, but the girl, with a cunning glint in her eyes, advised the guy not to get involved in this matter, so as not to get stuck in a swamp up to his knees. While some were shouting, a voice came from a nearby box, informing everyone that he was willing to give 2,000 medium-quality spirit coins for the box. This apparently amused our hero, as he calmly stated that he was ready to pay 3,000. Su Xing jumped up from his seat again and shouted at the top of his voice that smart people feed birds with grain, not magic fruits. And without any embarrassment in his voice, Wu Jin replied that he had just turned the clumsy girl into a true, noble phoenix who now needed a bride. At this point, the organizer began the countdown, declaring that our hero seemed likely to win, though he was puzzled as to why the Su and Zhu families were hesitating and not making the counteroffer he so desperately needed. Du, who was sitting nearby and listened to his brother's arguments, explained that the Su family had been at war for a long time, was constantly attacked, and spent a lot of money on defense. After a slight hesitation, he added that if it weren't for the agreement with the Zhu family's daughter, they wouldn't have enough coins even for daily training and maintaining the army's morale. Our hero thought for a moment and said that all this was unexpected for him. He was sure that everything was fine with their finances. At this moment, Su Xing, who was watching everything that was happening on stage, thought that the auction was extremely unfair. But the very next moment, Madame Zhu brought him out of his reverie by asking if it was true that the young man had run out of all his spiritual coins. And without waiting for an answer, she said in a joyful voice that she had spoken to her father, and he had given her a card, saying that all the spiritual coins that were on it could be used. And she added that Su Xing could take them to buy a miracle fruit for Su Ge. However, the one who overheard the conversation looked closely at the girl and told her that if they spent all the coins on this fruit, then the 1,000-year flame herb, and stopped. The red-haired girl, realizing what he was getting at, laughed and said that there was nothing wrong with that. Su Ge didn't seem to understand what was going on, so he decided to ask the girl why she decided to give him all that money. Zhu Baiyu, still smiling, happily said that she had been living like this for almost 20 years, so she had long been used to it. And a second later, raising her arms and showing off her biceps, which were clearly not feminine, she said that she had gotten used to her appearance and had reached a state where no one would dare laugh at her. And she continued, adding that if it helped Su Ge become more powerful, then her presence would fade into the background, and besides, not everything written in the book corresponds to reality. Looking at the encyclopedia, the girl did not calm down and continued that the properties of the 1,000-year-old herb of scarlet flame have not yet been fully studied, and it is quite possible that this plant will help control her strength and, perhaps, return her to her former appearance. And the next moment, handing the card to Su Xing, she shouted at him not to hesitate and to continue the bidding, which was about to end. A couple of seconds later, the guy grabbed his poster and started shouting that their clan was willing to pay 3,500 medium-quality spirit coins for the entire batch. As Du raised his card, increasing the amount to 4,000, our hero thought that family money had finally come into play, as resisting temptation was extremely difficult. The next moment, a real roar was heard in the hall, because completely different sounds were coming from different ends, and it was difficult to understand who was proposing what. The young man turned to Qian Shui and asked how many coins the Zhu family could spend, and immediately learned that the maximum amount was 8,000. Wu Jin quickly calculated that the Su family could add 3 more of their coins to the 8,000, meaning his maximum bet could be 10,000 spirit coins. And he was not mistaken in his calculations, because after Du's words, Su Xing immediately entered the auction, naming an amount equal to 10,500 spirit coins. Taking one look at the seemingly ordinary box, the organizers began the countdown, confirming that the auction was coming to an end. And literally a minute later, taking a large hammer and hitting the gong, the man said that the box was sold. Su Xing, wiping his forehead with his hand, seemed to have lost his composure. It seemed he was engaged in a physical, rather than verbal, struggle. After moving away a little, the young man said he would go pay for the goods. Running out of the hall, the young man thought with satisfaction how good it was that it was all over, because he had held on with all his might. Standing in front of the organizer, Su Xing heard someone nearby call them idiots for spending such a huge amount of money on some kind of incomprehensible box with unknown contents. However, he calmly replied that even without their participation, Lin Wuzun's clan would hardly be able to compete with the young princess's confidants, which meant that our heroine had no chance of obtaining the Scarlet Flame Herb. And as he left, he muttered to himself that after brother Sugu ate the fruit, his advancement in the spirit world would be very fast, although even by then there would be no room left in the city for the Lin Wuzun clan. Running into the chambers, the young man turned to his brother and ordered him to open the box as quickly as possible and eat the magic fruit for which they had fought so bravely. Sugu, with worry in his eyes, expressed his hope that he would not have the same fever as that poor bird and that he would not get the same fever as her. After hesitating for a moment, he turned to Su Xing and asked him to very carefully open the box to reveal its contents. Upon opening the box, everyone present immediately smelled the scent emanating from it, and what was inside could not be described with any decent words. Zhu Baiyu approached the box and looked inside, and affirmatively noted that, judging by the smell, it contained her boar dung. Everyone was confused, but not Su Gu, who quickly turned to the organizers and asked them to explain what had just happened. One of the men standing next to the gong said in a calm tone that he understood the outrage, but the Chamber of Commerce was not responsible for the contents of the goods, as it was only an intermediary in the transaction. And Wu Jin, who had been watching the whole thing closely, happily declared that he had warned the two clans to be careful when buying strange things, but they hadn't believed him. Enraged by such rudeness, Su Ge began to shout at our hero from the balcony, showering him with all sorts of curses. The very next moment he left the chambers and headed in an unknown direction, obviously to clarify all this with someone else. And indeed, a minute later the young man asked who this unknown person was who had put all these goods up for auction. It turned out that his interlocutor was Qin Yin, who, while sipping tea, remarked that she could not say anything since it was against the rules of the auction. Su Ge glared at the girl and asked her if this could be considered a declaration of war in alliance with other families. Looking closely at the young man, the beauty, still in a calm and confident voice, asked if he considered himself worthy of this. Sensing the growing tension, Brother Lu intervened, saying that this guy was talking nonsense, since the workers had clearly explained the rules of participation before the auction began. The next minute he added that the young man should not disturb the order inside the trading house and delay the process, since the young princess was waiting for their return. However, Su Ge did not give up. He clearly wanted to take revenge for everything that had happened and receive at least partial compensation. It seemed that Shidu also sympathized with the Su family, because in a conversation with Wu Jin, he remarked that he felt very sorry for that clan, and that those who did this had no heart. However, our hero noted that if their sister died, the combined Su and Zhu families would quickly swallow up their clan, as the Su family only came to the auction to prevent them from buying the 1,000-year-old scarlet firegrass. The next minute, he stood up from his seat and shouted that if the Su family really insisted on finding a supplier of boxes, then he would help them, because that supplier was himself. Turning closer to the box, and specifically to Su Xing, our hero added that the guy did not need to look for anyone, since the person he could not see was right in front of him. With a smile in his voice, the young man once again reminded everyone present that it was he who had suggested selling these wonderful boxes. Su Xing, who was the first to react to the situation, quickly threw a knife at Brother Lu, who was standing in front of him, and shouted threateningly, demanding that he return all the money immediately. However, Su Xing's behavior offended him so much that he shouted in anger that their family would have to do without this money. The knife blade returned and slightly grazed Su Ge, but he held on bravely and clearly had no intention of giving up. The Song clan representative, who continued drinking tea, asked her partners if they really thought the Kyushu Chamber of Commerce was a vegetable market. Wu Jin, who was standing nearby and supporting the girl, added that they would remember this lesson for the rest of their lives because it taught them a lot. Su Ge, still thirsting for justice, turned to our hero and told him not to think that the Chamber of Commerce would forever save him from punishment. However, our hero said with a grin that some schoolboy tried to intimidate him with loud speeches, and added that if he did not return the money, would they really intimidate him? Su Ge abruptly changed the topic, remarking that he wished he could see with his own eyes the disappointment in Wu Jin's eyes when he failed to obtain the 1,000-year-old firegrass. This seemed to worry many people, including Zhu Baiyu, who tried to reassure the groom by saying that money was not the most important thing in life. Su Ge began to talk about how he lost her money, but the girl, with sincerity in her eyes, noted that it was Wu Jin's fault because he was a deceiver, unlike her lover, who was a noble man. The organizers shouted something again about continuing the auction, and Sugu turned to our hero and said that he would see how long the young man could play his games. Wu Jin didn't seem to care at all, as Chi-Du flattered him, only advising him to use his brain wisely. In the next second, this guy thought that the Zhu and Su families, as well as the Yongzhou Palace, would no longer be able to spend much money to buy back the magic fruit, but he had more than enough of it. While he was pondering his plan, he listened to his brother's flattering remarks about how cunning he was. Shui approached the guys who were curious about where he got this magical fruit from, but he still didn't get a clear answer. At that moment, the organizers came on stage and announced to everyone that the final round of the auction was about to begin, and the most anticipated lot would be the 1,000-year-old scarlet fireweed. The man began to explain that this grass grows in the very center of one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the country, located in the southern part of the continent. The starting price of 1,000 coins didn't seem to surprise Brother Liu, who was powdering his cheeks at the time. The same cannot be said about our hero, because he was extremely surprised by this turn of events. However, the next moment something unexpected happened. A thick cloud of dust appeared in the hall, as if out of nowhere. Through the gray curtain, coughing people tried to see at least something to understand what had happened. True, after a couple of minutes, it became clear to everyone that all this was the work of an unknown ninja who was quickly heading towards the flower, standing on the stage. Our heroes watched in horror as the scene unfolded, and their brother turned to Wu Jin and asked who had sent this unknown ninja. No one could answer. Everyone seemed to be in deep shock, watching how skillfully the man wielded swords. Before those gathered had time to recover from one shock, they were immediately overtaken by another, because the hall suddenly began to fill with other people, dressed in exactly the same way. Brother Liu shouted for everyone to be careful, noting that the people who had arrived were masters of the spiritual rebirth realm. Looking at them, the representative of the Su family wondered where they came from in such a remote place, especially since few people knew about them. Qian Shui, who had been watching the scene closely, suddenly jumped up from her seat, grabbed her sword, and tried to defend herself and her people. Su Gu did the same, and without hesitation, he engaged in combat with one of the new arrivals, doing his best to defeat him. At the same time, he watched Wu Jin, who was heading somewhere, and shouted after him that it was very dangerous there, and therefore he had better go back. It was clear from the expression in the ninja's eyes that he understood perfectly well where our hero was heading, and, most importantly, for what purpose. Running away as fast as he could, Su Gu shouted in confusion, wondering if he was helping that guy or the unknown ninja. It seemed like things weren't going to be easy for Wu Jing, because the next moment, another master appeared in front of him, clearly intending to deal a crushing blow. Looking into the eyes of the unfamiliar man, he realized the rage in them, and after a little hesitation, he uttered just two phrases that sounded like a reprisal against the body. The young man didn't understand what this meant, but he did his best to resist, hearing Chi-Du calling him and trying to warn him about something. In the blink of an eye, the ninja directed his hand, full of a stream of fire, at our hero. It seemed that something irreparable was about to happen, but at some point this flow turned into glass, shattering into small pieces. Wu Jin, still standing, told someone that he was lucky because he was able to exchange the points he earned for defense. Qin Shui, realizing that our hero would not live long, turned to the parrot Bobo and ordered him to come to the aid of the young man. The very next minute, the inconspicuous bird again turned into a large and beautiful phoenix, which cried out that it was flying to the call. Realizing that help was close at hand, the young man screamed loudly and, turning to Bobo, struck his opponent with all his might. The bird sat on the ninja's hand, looking intently into his eyes and ready to carry out his command. And the very next minute, a thick cloud of fire burst from the phoenix's mouth, trying to burn the intruder. However, everything turned out to be not so simple. The ninja, clenching his fist, forcefully pushed Bobo back, declaring that he was a stupid bird that did not know how to behave. A second later, Wu Jin was lying on the ground, clutching the bird to himself, and heard his brother complaining that our hero was too heavy. Having risen, the young man noticed that his opponent was much stronger than he had expected, and that it would not be so easy to deal with him. Perhaps Qian Shui didn't think so, because she didn't retreat, but instead moved towards the ninjas who insulted Bobo and Wu Jin. At the same time, the girl shouted at our hero not to show bravery in vain, but to take care of his younger brother. The young man wanted to say something, but heard the beauty casually remark that he could only help her if he hid and didn't interfere with her. It seemed the brunette was well versed in martial arts, as she skillfully kept her opponent at a certain distance. In the air, she performed such pirouettes that it was difficult to even guess them, which clearly demonstrated the high level of her training. At some point, Wu Jin turned his attention to Su Gu, who was fiercely protective of his clan, as well as his fiancée's clan. Everyone else was doing the same. Everyone seemed to be busy fighting except our hero, who was just an ordinary spectator. Looking at everything that was happening, Wu Jin shouted the word system in anger, clearly wanting to replace something in everything that was happening. A moment later, a screen appeared in front of him, with a golden magic gun written on one side and useless magic written on the other, both costing 1,000 points. Having carefully examined the offered lots, our hero noticed that, apparently, none of this was the villain's weapon. And he continued his search, and it seems at the next moment his attention was drawn to something interesting. It was said that entering a battle would award 4,399 experience points for the shock experience during it. It was also said that different paths lead to the same goal, but no one knew how it worked. Lost in thought, the boy thought that the system seemed to want to set him up, but he understood that in any case, any objects with his aura would have a much stronger effect. Without a doubt, the young man pressed the exchange button, and the next second it seemed that he was burning with fire and filled with some kind of life-giving energy. In the following minutes, the attention of everyone gathered turned to our hero, who was puzzled by how the young man had changed so drastically. Wu Jin sat on the ground, clearly collecting his thoughts or considering his next move. The next step was to strike the enemy, but before that the young man decided to put all his strength into him. Stepping forward, the guy demonstrated all his strength, power, and determination with which he declared that it was his turn. The ninja, standing in front of Wu Jin, opened his eyes in surprise. He didn't understand what was happening or what was about to happen. While our hero was collecting his thoughts or choosing a victim, Qian Shui did everything possible to resist the attackers. One of them, carefully observing the young man, noticed that he was still too young to possess such incredible strength. The girl realized that her pursuers were approaching and thought about how best to act in this difficult situation. Our heroine, running away, asked Wu Jin for help, and he, in turn, turning to the ninja, asked him if he was really ready to attack a weak and defenseless girl from behind. Our hero's eyes were filled with rage and anger, and he screamed at the top of his lungs that he would not allow anyone to insult his sister. Jin was surprised to see that Qian Shui, who had recently asked for help, was now begging the boy to come back, convincing him that she could handle it on her own without outside help. Chi-Du shouted the same thing at our hero, telling him that he would not succeed, that he was too weak to win. However, it turned out that these words not only did not stop the guy, but, on the contrary, inspired him and gave him as much strength and endurance as possible. He looked at the enemy, peering into his eyes, and said that he was about to die. But the very next minute, something happened to the ninja himself that he least expected. Wu Jin's strong fist hit him in the face. Our hero, looking victoriously and insightfully at the attacker, shouted that his main opponent was himself and no one else. And, just a second later, the guy noticed how the man in black clothes flew back with force and fell to the floor. Apparently, Wu Jin himself did not understand how it happened, but he clearly liked it, so he declared out loud that the blow was truly brilliant. Looking at the lying ninja, the guy saw that the system had awarded him plus 75 points for this round, and he was very happy. Stopping, Qian Shui couldn't believe her eyes. This guy had managed to do the almost impossible. Chi-Du and Bobo, who were watching everything that was happening, also did not understand where Wu Jin suddenly got so much energy and strength from, because they had never noticed anything like this before. And then, coming closer, the ninja added that he was unlucky because he had hastily drawn conclusions about his strength based only on his appearance. His repertoire also included Chi-Du, who, smiling, thought that his brother had knocked out his opponent with one punch. And, not forgetting his self-confidence, our hero added that he could deal with at least 10 such opponents. However, the next moment the young man realized that something was wrong, although he did not understand where this danger was coming from. On the one hand, our hero noticed that some of the ninjas were in a hurry to leave, which he didn't like at all, because this guy wanted to show himself in all his glory. On the other hand, he saw one of them point his hand at him, clearly intending to present him with a not entirely appropriate gift. At the other end of the room, the Su family representative, floating in the air, noticed some strange black balls flying towards her, released by the hands of ninjas. A minute later, Brother Liu also shouted, asking someone to be careful, but it was hard to tell who exactly he was talking to. Our hero had difficulty understanding what was happening in the hall. He had the feeling that a fire had broken out around him, and something was shining brightly and unpleasantly. Wu Jin squinted and covered himself with his hand, trying to see at least something in order to understand what further actions he would take. However, all he managed to see was the ninja, who was still pointing his hand at our hero. True, he did not fully understand what was happening. And again, all the young man could see were thick clouds of dust covering the hall. And the next minute, everyone gathered was in shock. The hall was empty. The ninja had disappeared. The room was in a terrible state, as if after an earthquake. The most terrible and unpleasant thing was that the box in which the Scarlet Flame plant had recently been stored had disappeared. The first to recover from the shock was Brother Liu, who shouted that they could not allow the thieves to take the 1,000-year-old herb, and therefore it was necessary to organize a group to pursue the robbers. The one who surprised the crowd the most was Su Ge, who until recently had been very dissatisfied and irritated, but now called on everyone not to split up and stick together to defeat the enemy. Without any hesitation, Liu turned to Su Ge and asked if he was truly willing to cooperate with the Yongzhou Palace. In a calm voice, he replied that if there was a way to return the flower, he was ready to fight for Mrs. Zhu's happiness by any means necessary. It seemed that everything that was happening did not suit Wu Jin at all, who shouted that he had tried so hard to get this herb that he would stop at nothing to get it. In the very next moment, he reached for his wrist and began rubbing it suspiciously. This act did not escape the attention of Qian Shui, who asked the young man what had happened to his body and why there had been such a sudden surge of energy. The young man looked at this beauty in amazement, not understanding how to get out of this difficult situation. Scratching the back of his head, he replied that seeing how hard his sister was trying despite her rare disease made him angry about everything that had happened and was doing his best. And then, as if changing the subject, he suggested that the girl follow the bandits, adding that it was their responsibility to return the 1,000-year-old herb of Scarlet Flame. Qian Shui looked at the guy appraisingly and calmly replied that she would never do such a thing. A second later, she added that the young man looked great, but everyone had their own limits of strength, so he needed to stay with everyone and monitor his condition. Turning around, she abruptly left, hearing that Chi-Du also agreed with her wise decision. Qian Shui quickly dealt with Wu Jin, who was now lying on the floor, wrapped in ribbons like a doll, screaming at her to be careful while he was away. Brother Liu was also clearly not himself because despite everything that had happened, he noticed how good his powder was, which even after the battle continued to smell like flowers. Only Su Ge remained silent. His stern expression made it difficult to tell anything. Perhaps he was thinking about something, or perhaps he had already made a decision. The next moment, a very strange sound, reminiscent of clapping, was heard in the room. However, this didn't seem to bother our hero at all, as the guy continued to smile and calmly watch everything that was happening. And this is not surprising, because the popping sounds indicated that the ropes with which the girl had tied the guy so tightly had unraveled. Hearing Chi-Du surprise, the boy approached Bobo and, turning to him, said that he should not miss this plot under any circumstances, and if so, then he should play the role. Clutching the parrot in his hands, Wu Zin explained to him that he had become handsome thanks to the exotic fruit, but now he definitely needed a bride. In the next moment, Bobo, who had turned into a beautiful phoenix, shouted that the young man was telling the absolute truth. Smiling and teasing the bird, our hero finally turned to her and explained that it was time for them to set off on their journey. Mounted on such a beautiful bird, Wu Jin let out a threatening cry, so that the earth shook from their majesty. As he was leaving, he heard Chi-Du shouting after him, begging him to take him with him and not leave him alone with all the people gathered in the Chamber of Commerce. But it seemed he was no longer listening to him. Flying over the forest of monsters, the young man turned to Bobo, noticing that they were lost. Realizing that this was one of the most dangerous zones, and also forbidden, the young man wondered why all the loot wasn't hidden in these places, since they were considered lost, and magical animals also lived here. After wandering around the forest for a while and watching the smoke rising from the fire, the boy thought that something was wrong, and he needed to return to his older sister as soon as possible. Then he shouted at the bird, calling it stupid, and noting that this was the third time they had flown over the same place. A moment later, the young man noticed that he saw someone's resting place down there, and so he had to stop and find out everything he could. The clearing in such a strange place looked rather unusual. There was washed laundry hanging everywhere, a skeleton of some strange animal was lying there, and something was cooking in a cauldron. After walking around, the young man asked who was there because it was obvious that they had been living in this place for quite a long time. In the next moment, someone's strong hand, holding a sword, tried to lift it and strike. Our hero looked closely into the large eyes that clearly belonged to a girl, but remained silent. The reason was that the young man understood that the strength of this beauty far exceeded his own, which meant that he would not be able to defeat her. The silence was broken by a purple-haired beauty who asked our hero who he was and where everyone else was heading. The guy tried to back away and began to quickly explain that she was mistaken, since he and his bird were a little lost, but the girl did not understand how this was possible. She noted that people cannot simply disappear from the camp, and now the young man himself no longer understands anything. With tears in her eyes, the beauty said that she went to the spring for water, and when she returned, there was no one in the camp. Our hero, understanding her, stroked his new acquaintance on the head, calmed her down, and said that he would not leave her and would help her find out what happened. However, the next moment the girl, having moved away to a safe distance, decided that this was the most suitable distance and pressed something. Seeing the beauty lying on the ground, our hero said out loud that she had stumbled upon the wrong person, because he assumed that the stranger would try to poison him. Wu Jin noticed that the girl went to fetch water, but for some reason she didn't take any water with her. Besides, her shoes showed that she was just taking a leisurely stroll. The young man picked up the map from the floor, thinking that perhaps some organization was involved in this again. Then, looking around again, he added to himself that everything in the camp was clean and tidy, not a drop of disorder, which meant that someone was keeping a close eye on him. Our hero remembered the words of the stranger, who said that all the people from the camp were here, but did not understand where they went and when it happened. The next moment, the young man heard a voice ordering someone to sit down in a certain place. The guy realized that someone had arrived at the camp, and quite possibly not alone, and that these were probably the people the girl had spoken of. Our hero quickly jumped up from his seat and headed to the largest branch of the tree, from where he could look around and figure out what was what. The next moment, Wu Jin stood up on a tree, studying the surroundings and the area as a whole. Ahead of him, he noticed several young men walking quickly towards the camp. All of them were unarmed, or so it seemed at first glance. One of the men following the young man in the red robe tried to say something, but two raised fingers ordered him to remain silent for a while. Our hero, observing everything that was happening, began to guess that, most likely, using the maps that people had, they would be able to easily find the person. The next moment, realizing that the strangers had come as close as possible, he asked one of them why he was hesitating so much, since the camp had long since been cleared. The boy decided not to deviate from his habits, so he jumped from the branch and appeared right in front of the unfamiliar man. Holding a card in his hand, he said that they were both young, hinting at a possible acquaintance, and then added that he was afraid, so he asked strangers for cards to test them. The very next moment, one of the guys carefully and reluctantly handed the map to our hero. The young men, standing with their backs to the leader, began to express their dissatisfaction, noting that it was unclear where the young man's distrust and arrogance came from. Looking at the map, our hero thought that these were not the same guys because they were dressed informally. Although they looked like an army, it was obvious that they had certain skills, but at the same time, something indicated that they had gathered here temporarily. The next second, Wu Jin reported to all the men that everything was fine, he had completed his task, and was allowing everyone to move on. As they made their way to the camp, our hero and the stranger chief saw another man humming some popular song, clearly dedicated to the girl. The man in sunglasses asked where everyone was and happily added that he had brought drinks. The chief, clearly not understanding what was going on, turned to our hero with a question about how everything could be settled when there were strangers on the territory, but he, it seemed, did not listen to him, recognizing his teacher in the stranger. However, it wasn't only Wu Jin who was surprised, but also the teacher, who looked at the young man with bewilderment and seemed about to ask him 100 different questions. This meeting clearly did not bring the young man any pleasure, since he understood perfectly well that his identity was about to be exposed. As he was running away, the boy heard someone ordering him to be captured, and the teacher informed everyone gathered that it was the elder of the Lingwu sect from Gonlin City, clearly not wanting to reveal the whole truth. The owner did not stop shouting louder with each passing minute, not wanting to let the young man escape. The next second, the leader ordered us to surround our hero, as he also wanted to find out from this guy all the information he could about who he was. At some point, a bluish pentagram appeared on the field, and the yellow light emanating from it gave everything that was happening an extremely strange and even slightly frightening look. However, this situation did not seem to bother the leader at all, who shouted to his men not to hesitate, but to stop Wu Jin immediately. Although our hero, in turn, sharply raised his hand and headed towards the teacher, who, with an expressionless face, began asking the guy what he was doing. But he didn't lose his composure and, turning to the owner, asked him to play along, having heard not the most flattering words addressed to him about Bobo, whose feathers he was about to pluck. Apparently the parrot overheard the conversation, because the next moment, turning to the teacher, he said that if the owner dared to call him a bird, then he himself was a dog. The old man looked closely into the eyes of our hero and silently remarked that as soon as he looked into his eyes, the contract would be concluded. And the very next moment the teacher, still doing what Wu Jin asked, pretending that our hero had hit him, shouted how heavy the young man's hand was and how hard he had beaten him until he lost consciousness. A moment later, the owner lay at the young man's feet, wrapped in ropes, and the chief said with sadness in his voice that he had not expected this pathetic old man to be exactly such a person. It was unclear which person they were talking about, but a minute later this person said that all the support was coming from Yongzhou, so no one would interfere with the affairs of the camp, and this was natural because everything had been planned in advance by Zhua. Looking closely at his interlocutor, the young man asked with surprise in his voice who Zhua was. He then added that since the sect leader had been captured, he could sleep soundly, and finally noted that he had decided to deliver the man to the elder as soon as possible. Without slowing down and approaching the man, Wu Jin declared that capturing the master was a great achievement, and the elder should know about it, and if anyone had doubts, they could send someone along as an assistant. With a grin on his face, the commander declared that they were all comrades, and therefore he did not even have any doubts. However, the very next second, turning to one of the guys named Taiju, he asked him to come closer. And in a calm voice, he explained to the guy that he should help our hero escort the villain and quickly return back. Wanting to curry favor, Wu Jin addressed the leader as his superior, adding that if he needed to discuss something, he should not rush into it and should think it through carefully first. A minute later, moving through the forest, our hero decided to call the system and find out what it had to offer him. One of the tabs included an offer to return to the camp and bring gifts, but the young man didn't like it, deciding it was too impolite. Therefore, the next moment, Wu Jin switched his attention to the thunder bomb, hoping that this weapon would be useful to him. And, the very next second, the program gave our hero a small weapon that looked more like a rope. Returning to camp as if nothing had happened, Wu Jin asked the chief and his new assistant if they had resolved all the issues, and if so, it was time for them to set out. Turning to Taiju, the young man noted that working in a forest where animals lived was very inconvenient. But his partner said that they must strictly follow the orders of the elders. And then he suddenly and unexpectedly announced that the battle had been of a large scale. Many brothers had fought outside the forest, and now all the camps in Yongzhou belonged to them. Our hero thought with horror that everything connected with this clan had already happened, and fell silent for a minute, deciding not to continue this thought. However, the next minute, Wu Jin suspected that his sister was also in the forest, and so he said out loud that they needed to hurry. A couple minutes later, the boys headed to the elder Zhua's camp. Our hero quickly thanked the young man for his help and said that it was time for him to rest. Seeing the young man grab Taiju by the neck, he screamed in horror that he was brazenly going to take all the achievements for himself. Looking at his indignant comrade, our hero declared that he didn't know how to fight, and if that was true, then naturally all the achievements would go to him alone. In Wu Jing, Tai could only say that he seemed to be losing consciousness. A couple of minutes later, the young man deftly pulled a card out of the pocket of the man lying on the ground, and then took his clothes. As for the poor fellow, Wu Jin decided to tie him to a tree and leave him there. After this, the young man took care of the teacher, freeing him, and did everything possible to bring the teacher to his senses. Realizing that Wu Jin was slapping him hard on the cheeks, and finally coming to his senses, the teacher asked in a sharp voice if this scoundrel enjoyed hitting him. In an almost plaintive tone, the young man remarked that, of course not, all this was being done solely for the common good. While the teacher tried to defuse the situation, Wu Jin said that he planned to infiltrate the enemy camp to find out what these people were doing, and in the end he added that all this was being done for the safety of his sister. And only the teacher hinted that good intentions always come first. Dreaming of leaving as soon as possible, our hero invited the teacher to take part in an interesting adventure. However, as expected, with a serious expression on his face, he stated that he still had very important matters that he had to resolve. Quickly turning away from the young man, he was about to leave when Wu Jin grabbed his elbow and said that if the teacher helped him and his sister, she would not only be touched by such a feat, but would also pay him a good bonus. In the blink of an eye, the owner turned around and, with a satisfied look, joyfully declared that if this was so, then he was very lucky. After some time, the travelers stopped in front of a small but beautiful tent, around which a multitude of people who looked like soldiers had gathered. One of them turned to the men and, raising his hand, ordered them to stop and state their names. Coming closer to Wu Jin, the guard said that a new detachment had just recently moved into the forest, and if that was the case, then why had the unknown people come? Our hero was not surprised and reported that they were carrying out a secret mission from Elder Zhua, and how many heads would roll would depend on this mission. While one of the guards was studying the maps and did not notice anything strange, deciding that the travelers could pass, at the other end of the forest, someone turned to Zhua and told him that everything was ready. While in the company of young beauties, the young man talked about how soon he would get there, without specifying, however, where exactly. Taking a sip of the fine drink, he turned to the girls and ordered them to dress their master. Within a few minutes, the man who had previously been sitting in a robe acquired a very attractive appearance, by which one could judge his greatness. One of the girls, working on the belt of her dress, was unable to fasten it and was horrified to discover that all her efforts were in vain. And so, the very next minute, falling to the floor and covering her head with her hands, the beauty insulted herself with the most terrible words, calling herself an unworthy servant. Leaning towards the girl, the gentleman said that she should not be so upset, as he was always tolerant of beautiful ladies. And while she was humming words of gratitude, he ran his hands over her eyes, hearing the girl begin to apologize again, but this time for ruining her makeup. The next moment, something changed because the elders turning to the maid, asked her if the life of imperfect beings had value, and, hearing a denial, a moment later, did the irreparable. An unknown man performed some kind of magical act, as a result of which, it seemed, the girl turned into a zombie or something similar. He watched as the beauty fell to the floor without trying to do anything, and he didn't seem to regret what he had done at all. And this was the pure truth, because a moment later this gentleman announced to everyone gathered that he now had something to feed the animals. At this time, Wu Jin, walking through the camp with his teacher, noticed that there were many tents in the forest, not understanding what these people were doing there. Our hero's thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected sight. A wounded man was lying on a stretcher, and the owner, who had not escaped this, noticed that all these people had died at the paws of animals. Wu Jin clearly didn't hide his emotions, but he couldn't understand anything in detail because the guards rushed to our heroes, informing them that they had already arrived. And indeed, a moment later the men appeared in front of a small tent, at the entrance of which stood a man and another person, most likely his personal guard. Turning to Elderswa, he reported that foreign intelligence had arrived from the forest with important news. Not understanding what was happening, he looked closely at our comrades, who simultaneously crossed their arms over their chests and, closing their eyes, clearly greeted the leader respectfully. Most likely, the men were hoping for something else, but they heard Zwa's sharp voice, who called them brave for deciding to deceive him. The master quickly tried to backtrack, claiming that they had misunderstood and were in fact Yongzhou spies who had excellent evidence of this in the form of maps. However, as the leader shouted, pointing at the teacher and not understanding where such an old and ugly subordinate came from in his detachment, the old man meanwhile was perplexed as to how Zwa could recognize everyone by face. In order to somehow escape, Wu Jin quickly spoke, making up a story on the fly about the old man working undercover in the Lingwu sect in Ganling City. It seemed to work, because within a minute, seniors was stated that the man must be having a hard time, and then asked his name. As always, with a virtuous grimace, the teacher honestly admitted that his name was Chedu. However, after just a minute, the leader, with anger in his eyes, declared that his name was extremely unpleasant and that some ugly person was disgracing the appearance of his entire team. Changing the subject, he remarked that they had not gathered for that purpose, but because the men had come to report important news, and if that was the case, then the time had come to do it. Wu Jin took a deep breath and began to recount what they had discovered, then, hesitating a little, continued that the wise Taoist had returned. However, before he could say anything, the leader asked the man to be silent, wanting the old man to speak first. However, the very next minute something went wrong, because somehow our heroes found themselves behind the tent, and the young man was telling the owner not to lag behind, and ordered him to behave as quietly as possible. The reason for this was a cart pulled into the courtyard, covered with a blanket. After carefully examining it, Elder Zwa inquired how everything had gone. A man appeared in front, a wise Taoist, a subordinate of Liangzhou Shaoan, the head of the medical department, and stood next to the cage in which the stranger was held. There was horror in his eyes. He was asking for help, and there was nothing surprising about this, since next to him, behind the glass fence, there was an incomprehensible and wild monster. The wise Taoist explained to everyone gathered that this was an advanced bait for people that they were now observing, and it was bearing fruit. The man sitting in the cage looked into the eyes of the animal, which had already approached him, opened its mouth, and was clearly about to eat him. Our heroes, watching what was happening, couldn't bear it. It seemed like the monster was about to attack, but the boy still managed to tell the owner that all these people were locked in the cave. Jean finally realized that after eating, the spirit beasts, as they are called, become stronger and stronger. And indeed, the appearance of one of them was extremely terrifying. Red eyes and a huge mouth testified to the power of this animal. A minute later, the beast looked menacingly at the Elder Zwa, clearly intending to attack him. But he, turning to the animal, declared that it was making a reckless attack. A moment later, the wolf, with a cruel look, tried to attack its owner. Keeping his cool, the ruler said everything was fine, then added that it would be better if the beast kept its saliva and unpleasant smell to itself. The terrible thing that everyone expected did not happen, but quite the opposite happened. The monster turned into a soft and pliable creature that danced on its hind legs like a squirrel. Our heroes noticed that next to Elder Zwa, there was a spiritual enlightenment realm board, which he was most likely using at that moment. The young man thought that this board was like some level in a game, since only the strongest could move on to the next level. And then, opening the menu, I carefully studied that the board of the spiritual enlightenment realm and the primordial fire light the soul's luminary, and the power of heaven and earth dispels the sea's filth. And all this is collected on the spiritual board. As he delved deeper and deeper into his reading, our hero realized that he had not yet crossed the threshold of this power, which meant that he was still very far from it. Wu Jin continued to stare at the beast lying on the floor, still not fully comprehending the strength and power of the Elder Zwa. The teacher, understanding the young man's condition, approached him and said that it was difficult to control, a lot of time had passed, and the board had become a rarity. However, the very next minute our hero pushed the teacher away, shouting that he was distracting him because he could not hear everything that was happening in the conversations of his opponents. In the next minute, to Wu Jin's surprise, he took out his little ear and declared that he was a master of eavesdropping and knew how to do it best. And in order not to talk too much about this device, the teacher decided to show how it works by leaving the ear on the floor. Over time, it began to be used as a loudspeaker, but only for those connected to it. This small device allowed them to hear what the people sitting in front were saying. Chadu, deciding that they would not listen to him, a minute later spread several ears all over the field to keep his partner satisfied. And in the blink of an eye, it became clear how the ears worked, because one of them was located next to the gentleman and his interlocutor, transmitting everything to our heroes. The master, noticing the boy's confusion, decided to tell him that this was his true treasure, and then handed him a small object, ordered him to insert it into his ear, and explained that only in this way would he be able to hear what he needed. In the very next minute, the travelers heard someone say that the owner should not worry, because as long as they drove away the chi and grass, they would not be able to escape, although it was unclear who they were talking about. Elder Zwa then spoke, noting that Yongzhou was full of nobodies, and Lu Qianjiao's strength was acceptable, although he had already lost outwardly, and therefore did not cause any concern. He then changed the subject again, saying that the Moon Valley was considered a treasure trove of divine pendants and a worthy place for sacrifices. Chadu, listening to the men's conversation with amazement, did not understand what they were talking about, while our hero seemed to have guessed that the elder's interlocutor was the very man who had stolen the grass. Realizing that things were taking a dangerous turn, the young man silently turned to his sister, wanting her to be careful, since it was unknown what these people were doing. And before the guy had time to think about anything, the next minute he felt a large hand on his shoulder. It was the teacher who warned the young man that they would have to return anyway to avoid arousing suspicion. Looking at the man who continued to speak, he thought that this was a great chance to catch everyone off guard, but there was one drawback. He was still weak. The artificial ear conveyed everything so accurately that it seemed as if the storytellers were standing very close, although this was not the case, and the teacher really liked it. However, realizing that the eavesdropping was over, the teacher next cast some kind of spell that destroyed the eavesdropping ears so as not to leave any traces. And our heroes quickly hurried to the large tent where this gentleman was already located. They realized that they could not keep him waiting, and then they came up to him and explained how good it was that he had returned. With Elder Zwa's permission, they finally began their story, explaining that various sects and families in Qianling City had suddenly begun mobilizing, and while patrolling, they noticed that camps had begun to be set up outside the forest. Wu Jin continued, adding that their commander was afraid that things could change at any moment, which is why he sent them here, and also noted that they needed medicine. Hearing what had happened, Zwa was silent for a moment, pondering the words of our heroes. Then, in a calm voice, he said that he knew everything and would therefore send someone to investigate. As for the people, they could find a wise Taoist, get the medicine, and return. Without forgetting politeness, our heroes immediately bowed and thanked the owner of the tent. The elder thought for a moment again, and it seemed to him that he was about to say something else. However, the very next moment our heroes, realizing that nothing like this was expected, decided that it was time for them to leave. However, the men's instincts did not fail them, because before the door had even closed behind them, the owner called one of the ninja and ordered him to follow the strangers, and if any problems arose, to eliminate them. The eldest of the rulers noted with satisfaction how quickly all his orders were carried out. And after a short time, the teacher left the camp with Wu Jin, who went on further. During their walk, the owner told them that several centuries ago, two high-ranking beasts lived in the Moon Valley, but they were caught in a war and both died, and the Moon Valley was formed on their remains, and there is no place for weak beasts there. And at the same moment when it dawned on our hero, he remembered that the manual had spoken of treasures hidden there. At sunset, an unknown dragon was fighting with some man, and it was difficult to understand whether it was staged or actually happening. One thing is certain. The valley looked incredibly beautiful, but at the same time mysterious. Looking around, the young man noticed to himself that this was an incredible place, and what amused him most was that the guidebook described everything exactly as he saw it in reality. After looking around again, our hero turned to the teacher and, pointing to one of the sides, said that they most likely needed to move there, and if so, then they should get ready and move out. But, realizing that the teacher was standing motionless, Wu Jin decided to play a trick and, rushing forward, noted that if the teacher did not do this, then the people from the camp would definitely catch up with him. However, Sheva did not move from his place, turning to our hero, who barely heard him, and declared that something was really bothering him. And before he could finish speaking, the teacher felt that someone was standing behind him and threatening him with a weapon. And this was true, because behind him stood the very man who had been ordered to keep an eye on our travelers. Raising his hand, the master spoke louder the phrase he had said earlier, noticing that something was bothering him, and tried his best to make sure Wu Jin heard him. In the next moment, the pursuer's eyes widened to incredible sizes. He clearly saw something that surprised or frightened him. Not only the Moon Valley looked incredible, but also the forest of 10,000 demons, inhabited by many mysterious creatures. Looking at one of them, Jinseo noticed that as soon as they left the forest, the monsters increased in size several times, pointing to the one that the girl destroyed in the blink of an eye. Suge crossed his arms and agreed with her, adding that there were many more of them, and he was afraid he wouldn't be able to organize their support. The guy also added that there were 2 exits from Moon Valley that should be checked first, which Brother Lu readily agreed with. A minute later, Suge continued, noting that if everyone gathered allowed it, he would like to stay closer to Madame Zhu. Having listened to a satisfactory answer from everyone present, he took his red-haired friend by the hand and ran to where he was told. After a while, Lu and the other travelers came to an open area, and the guy said it wasn't as far as they initially thought. Qin Yin, who was running behind everyone, said that if it weren't for the obstacles on the road, they would have been able to get here much earlier, but fortunately, they still had a lot of strength. Turning to Brother Lu, she asked if they could let Su Ge and Bai Yu leave because they definitely couldn't handle life in Yongzhou Palace. The guy encouraged the girl and said that she shouldn't worry so much because everything was under control. And then he added that the king supported them in every possible way and allowed them to leave, hinting at Su Xing and another girl. Lu continued, noting that he hadn't previously understood why they followed him, but now he saw tenacity and strength in them, clearly hinting at Xian Shui. Zhu Baiyu, stroking her boar, was all sadness and thoughtful. It seemed that the girl was very worried about something. At this time, Su Ge was telling some stranger that there were no traces left, and noted that he had hidden the dirty clothes in the middle of the valley, and some idiots were still chasing after them. And, handing over some object to the assistant, he added that he could barely reach it, so he asked the man not to let him down. And he also suddenly said, when talking about Qian Saw, that although he couldn't clearly determine the spiritual power in her body, he was certain that it was no weaker than his own. The stranger noted that getting what he wanted would not be so easy, because Su Ji's blood was still weak, and the contents of the bottle might not be enough to improve blood circulation. However, as it turned out, Suga didn't care much about this. He said that even if nothing worked out, he still had a backup plan. As he made his way into the dense thickets of the forest, he heard his companion shouting, hoping that when the time came, this guy would not stand still, would not be so soft-hearted, since he had already made his choice and could not leave. At that moment, Zhu Baiyu ran up to him, wondering who the people were that the man had been talking to just a few minutes ago. Having received an explanation that they were assistants, the girl thought about it and began to weigh something. Holding the peeled walnuts in her hands, she asked if these people were needed so that they could best guard the entrance to the valley. It seemed that Su Ge wanted to steer the conversation in a different direction, so he suggested that the young beauty look for a better place to carry out their shared task. Coming out into the clearing and looking ahead, the young man began to talk about how soon this city would belong only to them. Realizing how romantic and wonderful it was, Baiyu looked at her fiancé with delight and could not believe her happiness. At this moment, at the other end of the grove, Qian Suo was carefully examining the footprints left on the ground. Raising her hand as if stopping the travelers, the girl noticed that the valley was inhabited by many different types of monsters. Interrupting her story, Brother Lu explained that there were only two huge demonic bones, one in the Soul Essence realm and the other in the Moon Valley, but usually these monsters did not dare to set foot here, not understanding what went wrong. Peering into the dense thickets of the forest, our heroes tried to discern at least something in them, although judging by the moonlight, it would be extremely difficult to do so. Qian Suo sniffed and noticed that there was too much blood in the air. The reason was that next to the place where our heroes were walking there was a corpse, which was most likely killed by someone. Standing on the edge of the abyss and looking at Brother Lu, Qin Yin, and Qian Suo, Su Gu and his assistant discussed how everything went smoothly, as this journey was a matter of life and death for the girl. And if so, then she would do everything possible to emerge victorious from this story. And once again she called out loud to the guys to hurry up, although they of course did not hear him. However, this was not necessary, as the trio ran through the forest as quickly as possible, remembering their task. After some time, our heroes found themselves among the rocks of a dark forest, which filled the valley with horror. All three looked ahead and did not understand what awaited them, and how events would develop in the future. Brother Lu was the first to take the dangerous path, and those who followed him noted this courageous act. Putting his fingers to his nose, the young man noticed that a very strong and unpleasant smell was coming from ahead. Following them, Qin Yin noted that the situation in the valley was very dangerous, and furthermore, the teacher said that they had an important task, and if they did not act with risk, they would not be able to enter the valley. After listening carefully to the girl, Lu said that it would be better to go back and tell everyone else about everything, while he himself would continue to explore this ruined place. The guy added that the ancient ruins were about to open, and the red fire grass could help them improve their development. Realizing that the girls were still standing motionless, the young man turned to them again, explaining that they needed to recover, and then he would go alone, though Qian Suo immediately objected. Qin Yin decided it was best for her to leave, so she wished the boys good luck. The very next minute, she returned to the forest as quickly as possible. The travelers did not even have time to track her before she disappeared from sight. Left alone, Lu turned to our heroine and asked if she really wanted the red fire grass to suppress the cold in her body, which would help her escape. And, having waited for an affirmative answer, Lu added that in another situation he would have given her to the beauty, but the little princess demanded the opposite. Hearing the girl speak again of life and death, he added that if he were the ruler of the realm of enlightened spirits, they would have to rely only on beauty. And while Qin Shui was studying him with his eyes, he expressed the hope that they would be able to transport this plant to Qin Yin and bring the people back there. Standing among the rocks and smelling the same foul odor, Lu carefully considered what action they should take. However, the very next minute, with amazement in his eyes, turning first to himself, then to the girl, he shouted that something incredible was waiting for him ahead. He added loudly that right in front of him, he saw fiery red grass that could not be compared to anything. However, the children saw not only plants, but also wild animals that guarded this grass. Wondering why there were so many of them, the beauty realized that the monsters were afraid to enter the foggy zone. The next moment, the young man saw some kind of golden dust approaching his face. Turning to his companion, he noticed that it was the same pollen he had left behind. But a moment later, his gaze was drawn to the silhouette of a ninja lying on the ground. Moreover, it was this pollen that was emanating from him. There was anger in the young man's voice, and he began to shout and express indignation, claiming that the worst thing that could happen was deception. In an instant, the animals surrounded them from all sides, growled and gathered into some kind of large herd. Among them were animals that our heroes had never seen before and which came as close as possible to them. There were wild boars, wolves, rams, and other animals, but none of this seemed to matter. All of them, like a flock, followed each other along different paths leading to the place where our heroes were. The traveler's attention was drawn to a huge accumulation of human skeletons, clearly belonging to an attempt to pull out the scarlet grass. The animals were slowly but surely approaching this pile, but for what purpose the boys still didn't understand. The next moment, Lu shouted that in front of them was the legendary magical spear Li Chuan, capable of controlling people's minds. And after a moment, it dawned on the young man. He said that someone wanted to sacrifice them to these monsters in order to take possession of the spear, and if that was so, then there was not a minute to lose. The boy's gaze was drawn not only to the animals, but also to the girl, Qin Yin, who was rapidly approaching our heroes. Lu called out to her and asked why she had come back if she had decided to leave. The beauty sharply replied that a group of monsters had entered the valley and blocked the way, and if this was so, then the only way out was from the other side. However, after just a minute, Qin Yin, who had remained calm until then, upon seeing the spear, impulsively began asking the guys where it came from in these parts. At this time, on the other side of the crevice, Su Gu raised his hand and, as if addressing someone, began to shout that they were starting. Stones of different sizes with various inscriptions were laid out in front of the young man, but it was impossible to make out what was written on them. In the center of the ground, a sign appeared, surrounded on all sides by an incomprehensible red web. At that very moment, the spear, which already looked terrifying, seemed even more menacing, especially after it was illuminated by a golden color. Lu and Qin Yin watched the scene in amazement, not understanding how to act in this situation and how it happened that they were trapped. The boys were frightened by the animals approaching from all sides. Our heroes felt as if they had turned into zombies, unquestioningly following someone's orders. Holding the sword in her hands, Qian Shui clearly had no intention of giving up and was thinking about her next plan of action. She looked closely at the animal bones, which suddenly began to glow with the same red light as the spear. The girl had a feeling that some magical action was about to happen that would bring these animals to life. Now the red grass, which was once so desirable, no longer seemed so attractive and interesting. This was because Qian Shui looked at her from a different angle, from the perspective of a creature that grew not from the earth, but from the bodies of animals. Finally, the beauty realized that the demonic beast gave birth to the plant from which the red flame grows, so it was not just an ordinary grass. Our heroine looked at the spear with horror, not understanding where this whole complex and confusing story would lead. She knew one thing for sure. All this had turned into a trap for her and her companions. Qian Shui's eyes widened, filled with horror and surprise. Realizing that the evil spirits of the forest would not stop so easily, the girl quickly grabbed her sword, not intending to give up so easily. It seemed to the travelers that this simply would not happen, because the ominous entities continued to appear from different directions, moving as if on someone's command. Su Ji's new assistant, addressing him and his companions, said that they should move forward and prepare to enter the valley. He said that the young men should take one red fire grass of scarlet flame with them, and added that if the spear reached them, he would not be able to help them. Holding the fire grass in her hands, Zhu Baiyu didn't understand how she got this plant, but Su Gu said that she would understand everything later, and for now, she should just take the plant with her. The next moment, the assistant spoke up, declaring that he was destined to witness the awakening of the demonic spear, and he was looking forward to the event with great excitement. A moment later, ordering everyone to head to the valley, he added that he wanted to ensure the success of the bloody sacrifice and the completion of the young lord's task. This whole incident didn't seem to bother Zhu Baiyu at all, who, despite everything, offered Su Gu some walnuts, insisting that he eat them. However, the young man did not have time for this. He noted that all this should be postponed for later, and now the most important thing was to complete the business for which they had started all this. And, leaving, he shouted to her to follow him. The dark night was gathering over the valley. A foul smell still hung in the air, and it was through this that the phoenix tried to at least make out something through the red curtain. Wu Jin, riding on his trusty bird, turned to her and declared that all these monsters were attracted by the gang from Yangzhou, and then added that they looked extremely strange. The very next minute, turning to Bobo, who was already flying with all his might, he said that they needed to hurry to find their older sister in time. The bird, perfectly understanding its owner, developed incredible speed, realizing that danger was very close and they might not make it in time. Having looked around carefully, our hero asked the phoenix to descend a little lower because they were too high, and it was difficult to see anything through the darkness of the night and the curtain. Literally a couple of minutes later, the situation changed. The young man noticed something below that immediately caught his attention. Walking along the stone path, mesmerized Shui, realizing how scared she was at that moment, shouted her name. Realizing that he and Bobo had accomplished the impossible, the boy asked the bird to begin descending as quickly as possible. A couple of minutes later, standing in front of the girl, the young man waved his hands and said that he had finally found his sister, asking if she was surprised to see him in front of her. Without waiting for an answer, the young man continued his story, explaining that along the way he had encountered a group of people and learned of the terrible plot they were preparing. And if so, then they need to leave this place as quickly as possible. And here he added humorously that the girl would be able to praise him. But in safety, although it seemed, the beauty did not hear either these or other words. Looking at his elder sister's glassy eyes, Wu Jin became suspicious, so he began clapping his hands and shouting her name loudly to bring her back to her senses. At the same time, the young man watched the terrible picture unfolding before him. He saw how something began to devour the animals. Everything happened so quickly that after some time, only skeletons remained of the forest creatures, which are evidence of horror. It seemed that our hero could not believe his eyes. He did not even understand how this was even possible. The Li Chuan demon spear. He thought that it was unlikely to be equipment that had fallen from the 10,000 demon forest. As he continued to look around, he thought that it was all because of the spear, but the saddest thing was that even the demons fell into this trap set up by the people of Liangzhou because they were the only ones interested in it. Not realizing that the enemy would probably want to enjoy everything that was happening, the young man realized that he needed to get his sister out of these places as quickly as possible. Clutching her leg, he began to scream loudly, calling for the girl and begging her to wake up from the obsession that had taken hold of her. But everything turned out to be not as simple as the young man thought at the very beginning, because, having stepped over him, the beauty headed forward towards the mountain. Wu Jin did not give up. He turned to the girl again and again, even decided to ask her for forgiveness, in the hope that such words would certainly be able to touch her heart. Having reached the point of despair, the young man decided to take an extreme action. He grabbed his sister by the leg with his teeth, believing that at least the pain would bring her out of the trance. And indeed, the next moment, when Qian Shui stopped, it seemed like the essence of what was happening began to dawn on her. With bloody lips and eyes full of hope, our hero even began to feel confident of his success. However, not even a few seconds had passed before the beauty pushed the young man away and stepped forward again, approaching the demonic spear. The young man seemed to be about to fall into despair, and, turning to himself, he declared that he was too weak and could not behave rudely, and even if he could, he did not understand at all what to do. The young man was distracted from his thoughts when Bobo told him that people were approaching the path. The boy was sure that these were people from Liangzhou, which meant he had to save his sister, but since he couldn't do it directly, he had to go to the valley to deceive the criminals. And the very next minute the parrot, having once again turned into a phoenix, soared into the sky to assess the situation together with its owner and figure out what to do next. 3 people were heading towards the valley, one of whom was Su Gu. Upon seeing him, our hero became indignant and howled. He thought to himself that he had always considered this man a scoundrel, because it was already clear from his appearance that he was a bandit trying to hide his inclinations behind the mask of a well-wisher. The next moment, the young man saw someone from the clan raise his hand, in which he held a 1,000-year-old scarlet flame herb. Once again, with anger in his eyes, Wu Jin shouted that Su Ge had come up with all of this, and what's more, that he had devised the most sophisticated plan. Standing below and looking at the monsters that were reduced to skeletons, Su Ji's assistant said that the blood sacrifice method had worked, meaning they would be able to obtain the demonic spear. The next moment, turning his gaze to Qian Shui, he began to carefully study her, thinking about something. Taking her face in his hands, the man said that it was a pity to lose such a beautiful face, but did not finish speaking. In the very next minute, hugging the girl, he said that she smelled like an innocent child, which seduced him even more. Jean, consumed with rage, watched everything that was happening from the top of the cliff, mainly because he could not influence the situation in any way. As he began to fidget, he didn't notice how stones of different diameters fell down with a roar. Realizing that something irreparable had happened, our hero decided to shift the responsibility to Bobo, telling him that his shadow was visible from afar and that they could be declassified. And just a moment later, realizing that something urgently needed to be done, he turned to the system, wanting to find a way to save his sister. True, there were some rather strange things on the menu. One of them was a fan, and the other was chow tian pepper. Clutching his head, our hero screamed that they were again trying to foist something unnecessary on him, and, turning to himself, added that he was already quite fed up with this. Within a minute, the guy became extremely tense, saying that he needed to pull himself together and carefully consider what advantages he had over his opponents. It turned out that the next second the guy had an idea. He decided that his opponents lacked information and had an insufficient way of thinking, while he himself knew much more. And indeed, the next second he smiled and voiced a plan that included the bird and the forest, although Bobo did not understand what it meant. Be that as it may, the young man quickly began to undress, clearly realizing that everything was not right. He really needed to hurry because Su Gu, who was standing in the gorge and calling out to his friends, said that they had no time to waste. They needed to finish everything as soon as possible. With anger in his eyes, the assistant asked the man if it was true that he was so eager to take over the city. In a calm voice, he noted that he had waited too long for this day, and all who had humiliated him and his family would have to pay for it. And he added that once they got rid of the beauty and returned to the city, none of the sect members would escape. Looking into the eyes of the enchanted brunette, Su-gu continued that after so many years of struggle, he had finally achieved victory, and therefore, when he was at the peak of his glory, he would carve the girl's name on a monument. Grabbing Qian Shui by the throat, he began to squeeze his hand with all his strength, saying goodbye to the girl and saying that it was all over. However, the situation suddenly changed. Someone shouted threateningly at the man, demanding that he quickly let the girl go. All three of them widened their eyes as they looked at the moon. It seemed to be talking to them, and at the same time the voice continued to ask about what people were capable of. Suddenly, a strange figure with large wings and inhuman legs, reminiscent of a mysterious creature, appeared against the background of the moon. Everyone gathered commented that it was a terrifying figure, and Su-ji's assistant said that the creature had shed its beast body and taken on a human form, but it was still a demonic beast from the spirit world. The man continued his speech, noting that this is a kingdom where the soul is between heaven and earth, where it is immortal, lives forever, and therefore even without the red flame herb, it is not at the mercy of the spear. Madame Zhu noted with horror in her voice that this was most likely one of the lords of the forest and the demon network, although she was not sure of it. Our hero, clearly enjoying this performance, noticed that the wind from the fan was so strong that it seemed as if he himself would be blown away. However, this did not matter, since the main goal had apparently been achieved, and the young man realized that his opponents had fallen for his trick. And they, in turn, thinking that they were addressing the Lord of the Forest, told him that they did not want to insult him, but only wanted to take the demonic weapon. When he heard the man offering compensation to a fictitious forest demon, he lost his temper and declared that if anyone tried to kill people on his land, everyone would think he was a Satanist from the demonic forest. Su-ji's assistant understood what the strangers were aiming for and forbade them from invading, so fulfilling their wishes was unlikely to bring results. In the very next second, Wu Jin confirmed these assumptions, ordering these insignificant people to shut up and leave the forest, otherwise they would remain in it forever. The assistant did not stop and tried to explain to the Lord of the Forest that if they did not return the demon army, the head of the clan would become angry and furious. Our hero thought to himself that he had encountered a simple-minded interlocutor, but he declared out loud that he was not one to be trifled with. To make this sound as convincing as possible, he continued by saying that it seemed they would not understand the meaning of his words until he showed them, and a second later he ordered everyone to return to the camp and collect the bodies. The next minute, the air became thick with the smell of smoke and fumes, and through the dense thickets of the forest it became clear that something was burning, and very hotly. The three of them stood there, perplexed, watching what was happening. It turned out that until recently they had not believed that the so-called forest spirits could go so far. Our hero, continuing to play his role, said that the next film would not be about a camp, clearly hinting at something more serious. Although at that very moment, Wu Jin himself was frightened by how serious the fire he had caused was, not understanding how such a thing could have happened. Su-ji's assistant tried to appeal to the forest lord again, asking him if he had caused them all too much harm. However, with anger in his voice, he said that all those gathered must leave here or remain forever in this thicket, where no one would ever find them. Su-gu, who was standing nearby, did not want to give up so easily, and therefore whispered in his assistant's ear to start using the magical weapon given to him by his master. But in response he heard a sharp refusal. As he left, he added to everyone gathered that they had overestimated their nature and strength, because he was not an opponent of the demonic beast in the soul realm and did not intend to die. These words did not move Su-gu at all, who shouted after the man that they were so close to success, and simply gave up. As he ran away, the assistant replied that everyone decides for themselves what to do, and if they want to die, there is no need to drag everyone else along with them. Our hero, watching the fugitive, did not understand how quickly and easily he could be frightened, so he came up with another solution and ordered the man to stop. Turning around, the assistant smiled and asked the forester what else he needed, and he, continuing to play his role, asked if this man really still wanted to take something from his forest, clearly hinting at something specific. Placing the red box on the floor, the assistant explained that they needed to take one herb each, otherwise they would not be able to leave the valley and would be enchanted by the spear's power, adding that they only had 3 extra pieces left. However, it turned out that our hero did not really listen to him, because he realized that the grass had grown with the help of a spear, which meant that all 3 were of sound mind. And at the same time he realized that if he gave the plant to his sister, she would wake up. At the same time, Wu Jin was surprised at how he and Bobo managed to not use a single sprout and still maintain their sanity. Before our hero had time to think about anything else, the next moment he heard the voice of the assistant informing the forest lord that they were leaving. However, here too, Wu Jin decided to joke, so he told everyone gathered that he had given the order to roll, but not to leave. And while Su Ge was about to object, the assistant, clearly understanding the seriousness of what was happening, began to do what he was told, that is, to group and roll. As for the Su clan representative, he was seething with anger and dissatisfaction, but he clearly understood that he had no other choice, and therefore did not dare to object. In the next moment, all three, with a deafening roar, moved away from the valley. Our hero, who had been watching everything that was happening, was clearly amused by this scene. He could not even imagine that the plan would be crowned with such success. The next second, Wu Jin shouted to the bird to hurry up and fly as low as possible. Having descended as close as possible, our hero jumped off Bobo and ran in the direction where the red box lay. A second later, 3 small plants of scarlet flame were already in his hands, which the young man was going to distribute to everyone who had been bewitched by his opponents. Qian Shui was the first one he approached. The young man brought the herb to her face, turned to the girl, and asked her to come to her senses. However, it seemed that the beauty did not hear him. Her sister looked at the young man with wide-open eyes that expressed nothing. Although the very next moment something began to happen. Our hero seemed to notice a clearing in the form of some emotions that began to appear on his friend's face. Without taking his eyes off Qian Shui, the guy extended his hand to her, asking how the beauty was feeling and if everything was okay. Even though the girl remained silent, her expression actually changed. It showed slight embarrassment, but also anger. And indeed, less than a minute later, the brunette screamed, turning to our hero and asking why he was naked. While getting dressed, the young man told the beauty that everything had happened this way, not by his will, but simply because circumstances had worked out that way. Looking around, Qian Shui seemed to be trying to understand what had happened and piece together the whole picture of what had happened. And the very next moment, looking at the guy who had managed to pull himself together, she wondered if he had really saved her. With noticeable embarrassment in her voice, the brunette tried to explain to the young man that he was forbidden to go, and then, changing her tone, asked how he was feeling, whether he was injured, but he told her with a smile not to worry, since he was fine. Changing the topic, he added that this red fire grass was finally in their hands, and then said that the people from Liangzhou might return, so they needed to leave as soon as possible. Qian Shui looked at the young man in confusion and asked what had happened, but he assured the beauty that he would explain everything to her when they went out. In the very next moment, the brunette turned her gaze to her companions, asking Wu Jin to take them away, and received an affirmative answer. While our heroes were recovering, the 3 criminals, having returned to the camp, continued their conversation about how they were one step away from victory. Su Ge, whose speed was steadily increasing with each passing minute, told his friends with some doubt that he was always haunted by a feeling that something was wrong. A second later, his fiancée also spoke about this, telling everyone gathered that she thought she had heard the voice of the forest demon somewhere before. Su Ge immediately slowed down, stopped, thought about everything carefully, and then told his friends that there were many strange things in this whole story. Turning to his companions, he asked them whether they did not think that it was too easy to communicate with the Lord of the Forest. Reasoning, he added that if this was the realm of souls, then its owner could have killed them, but he did not do this. In the next moment, that guy suggested that everyone return, since they could not miss such a chance. The assistant, who listened carefully to Su Ji's words, agreed with him, adding that he knew nothing about this place at all, but it would be better to go back and think everything over carefully again. And while the criminals were gathering their thoughts, Wu Jin had already managed to bring a flower to Brother Lu, telling him to wake up. At the same time, our hero was doing everything in his power, and Qian Shui, looking into the distance, informed the young man that someone was quickly approaching them. It was Su Ge, who ran so fast that it was hard to imagine how furious the young man was, shouting Wu Jin's name. The same man who was never able to bring Lu back to consciousness, not understanding why it took him so long to come to his senses. In the very next minute, jumping up from the ground, he shouted to the young man to get up, since the enemies were already nearby, and there was no time to lie down. A moment later, our hero saw how one of the guy's eyes finally began to open, and so with joy in his eyes, he announced this to everyone present. Brother Lu stood up and clasped his hands over his face, trying to figure out why he was in so much pain, while listening to Wu Jin say that Su Ge was the only one to blame for everything. It turned out that the young man would come to his senses and would ask questions for a long time, since everything was very confusing to him. However, our hero was neither confused nor angry. He repeated again, but now for the sake of his brother, that this was the work of only one person, whose name he had already named. At that moment, 3 criminals were standing not far from our heroes. They were clearly planning something, but didn't know how to start. The one who stood out the most in this team was Su-gu himself, who even in such a situation tried to show all his superiority, strength, and power. Turning to Wu Jin, he threateningly stated that he had already made a fool of him more than once, and if this was true, he intended to beat the young man. Finally, Lu, who was still sitting and rubbing his face, began to understand the meaning of Wu Jin's words. Glaring menacingly at Su-gu, Lu turned to the enemy and asked how he dared to come here and threaten them all. The next second, our hero ran up to Brother Lu and shouted at him to stop pretending and think about how they could escape. However, it turned out that he did not listen to the young man, since he calmly declared that intrigues were worth nothing in the face of absolute power. Continuing to examine the villains, he noted that at the 9th stage, Su-gu was not his opponent, clearly hinting at something interesting. However, at that very moment, the assistant loudly announced that our hero did not understand the whole situation and still did not realize that the owner had many abilities necessary for victory. Looking at Wu Jin, Lu inquired about the identity of the person who had just spoken to him and noted that he was one of the criminals who had stolen the red firegrass. With an angry expression, the brother muttered under his breath that it was the people from Liangzhou who were so greedy and treacherous. The unexpected silence was broken again by the assistant, who said that our heroes were supposed to leave this world peacefully, but this did not happen, so we will have to deal with them again. Raising his hand, he added that it was time for them to say their final words. Our heroes, who made up the majority, looked attentively at the 3 criminals, and they, in turn, did not take their eyes off them. Wu Jin suddenly muttered harshly under his breath, "Do they have a chance of winning if they go 5 against 3? Lu, hearing our hero's words, said that even if he and Qin Yin did not immediately use their treasures and fight this freak, at best they would be able to achieve a draw. Looking at Qian Shui, he guessed that she was about the same as a woman with immense strength. The brunette didn't answer, but stared into the distance in surprise, clearly pondering Brother Lu's words. The beauty still clutched in her hand the precious herb, which was very important to her. However, the next second, Lu spoke again, saying that once Su dealt with the 2 of them, they would no longer have a chance of winning. These words clearly infuriated Wu Jin, who, standing behind him, asked the young man what he was holding on to and why he was thinking so actively about his rivals. Shui intervened in the conversation, saying that by taking the red flame herb, she would be able to break through to the spiritual realm. And then, the beauty didn't have time to finish speaking because she was suddenly interrupted, told that she wouldn't succeed. Her plans simply wouldn't work. Lu explained that the flower was a catalyst. Among other things, it was initially tainted with the enemy's own hostility. A second later, he added that by accepting this, the girl would make a breakthrough for a short time, but the energy of the grass would penetrate the body, and eventually the beauty would lose herself. Looking into the girl's sad eyes, he continued that the energy would get out of control, and then she would probably die. Wu Jin suddenly intervened in the conversation, declaring that everyone's survival or death depended on who was stronger, he or Su-gu. Closing his eyes, the brother said with a sinister tone in his voice that our hero was absolutely right, and theoretically everything would be exactly like that. Hearing this, Su-gu laughed joyfully and told his friends that there was no task he could not handle. And then, with a serious tone in his voice, he convinced everyone present that they needed to remain calm, because Wu Jin would never be able to defeat Su-gu on his own. Qian Shui, realizing the seriousness of the situation, turned to Wu Jin and noticed that despite his increased strength, it was still inferior to his opponents. However, our hero, with his characteristic positivity and cheerfulness, noted that this was not a problem for him, and once again assured everyone that they should not worry about him. Inspired by the boy's words, Qin Yin decided to compliment him, saying that he was an interesting person and she wouldn't want him to die in this valley. Suddenly, everyone else joined in the conversation, and, as they left the battlefield, they warned our hero not to die too quickly, and Qian Shui warned the young man that if things got too tough, he should hide in a safe place. And finally, winking at the guy, Qin Yin added that in this fight, as in life in general, everything depended only on him. Turning to Bobo, Wu Jin remarked with displeasure that all his new friends thought too highly of them, and if that was the case, then he needed to show them what it meant to be proud children of heaven. The next minute, our hero's thoughts and conversation were interrupted by Su Ji's assistant, who angrily declared that there would be one less guard today, clearly hinting at this guy. Suddenly, Zhu Baiyu also spoke up, shouting loudly for everyone to hear, declaring that for her brother's sake, she would not give up easily and would fight. The next moment, Su Ge decided to say something. Turning to our hero, he seemed to hesitate, not knowing whether to praise him for his bravery or, on the contrary, call him an idiot, and then added that he didn't expect this trash to be so brave. And within a minute, our hero decided to launch the system to increase his strength enough to pass this difficult competition. Smiling, the young man thought to himself that the time had come to see a miracle, and the very next minute he asked to show him the spiritual fruit. Watching everything that was happening, Su Ge couldn't believe his eyes, or rather, his ears, because he didn't think that the young man still had the magical fruits left. But before he could think of anything else, his attention was drawn to Wu Jin, who seemed to have been reincarnated as some kind of demon capable of anything. Our hero's adversary's eyes reflected amazement and fear. He clearly hadn't expected such a turn of events. However, in an instant, Wu Jin felt that he was equal in size to Bobo, who was flying nearby. It seemed that the question of power was in the language of a bird that did not dare to say anything, realizing the complexity of the situation. However, after just a minute, our hero spoke up, turning to himself, and surprised by the lack of reaction, thinking that perhaps the reason lay in the increase in level or resistance to spiritual fruits. However, before the young man could finish speaking, Su Ge shouted out that this guy imagines himself to be someone unknown, thinking that he can succeed at any moment. And the next moment, looking at our hero, he raised his hand and began to pull it towards Wu Jin, shouting for him to finally die. Realizing that everything was extremely complicated, the young man opened the system again and again, wanted to try something different. Shui, who was watching everything that was happening, shouted at our hero, trying to bring him out of his reverie and bring him to his senses. The girl saw how the enemy's strong hand was about to touch the young man's head, delivering a crushing blow. Su Ge screamed like never before. He did everything he could to finally put an end to his enemy. However, it turned out that for Wu Jin this was completely unimportant, because, having replenished his reserves of spiritual energy, he finally felt the strength and power that he had expected. And this time everything really worked out well, because our hero seemed to be reborn. A fire flared up around him, testifying to his strength. The blows were so powerful and impressive that Su Ge, sitting on the ground, did not dare to approach. They came as a real shock to him. He widened his eyes as he looked at his opponent, either considering his next move or reconsidering his entire plan. As for Wu Jin, he was so inspired that he had no intention of giving up, displaying his strength to everyone gathered, as if to prove that he was no longer the young man he had been just a few minutes ago. The young man's opponent also didn't dare to initiate combat. It seemed he simply wanted to frighten Wu Jin and end the matter once and for all. And Su Ge, still in shock, shouted in a trembling voice, "How is it possible that this is happening now?" Those present, who had been watching everything that was happening with bated breath, calmly declared that the young man had made a breakthrough, that he had truly achieved a lot. Qian Shui was one of those who couldn't take her eyes off Wu Jin, but she didn't want to discuss it with anyone, so she just watched silently with her friend. And he, with a smile on his face and a calm voice, told everyone gathered that this was just the beginning and the most interesting was yet to come. In the next second, our hero opened the menu again to find spiritual fruits that could help him. He seemed to eat them with a force he had never eaten before, knowing that this was his only chance of winning. Wu Jin watched his level rise, not believing that he had managed to reach the 8th stage in such a short period of time. And after a short time, he reached the 9th level, the very one he had been waiting for so long and had spent so much time and effort to achieve. Su Ge, without taking his eyes off the young man, noticed that he was hot standing in this place. It felt like his legs were melting. And this is not surprising, because the enemy was almost completely engulfed in the fire of his opponent's power. Su Ji's face twisted in anger and confusion, and he asked in a barely audible voice what Wu Jin was doing here and how he had managed to reach such a level. However, the next moment the guy saw a heavy hand approaching his face, intending to strike. This blow actually landed, and it was so powerful that Su Ge was sent flying several meters into the valley. Not wanting to look pathetic or weak, he immediately hurried to get up from the ground, demonstrating his endurance and willpower. The guy's face was distorted with anger and displeasure. He looked at our hero with disdain and asked him what he was doing. However, instead of answering, the guy saw an approaching enemy who clearly had no intention of settling the matter in a businesslike manner. And it was true, because within a second, Wu Jin began to strike his opponent. While doing these actions, he shouted that Su Ge first stole his grass, and then framed his sister. A second later, the guy continued, adding that this insignificant person dared to show off in front of everyone for his own benefit. Watching the scene in horror, Zhu Baiyu shouted at the young man, realizing that he would be no match for Wu Jin. Kneeling and wiping away the blood with his hands, he seemed so exhausted that he could not even get up. Su Gu realized that a smug opponent had approached him, and he told him straight to his face that he had overestimated his strength. The next minute, our hero shouted at the offender and demanded that he admit defeat, which was already obvious. The young man quickly clenched his fist, showing with his action that he was not going to stop and wanted to see the matter through to the end. However, he was in no hurry to strike, carefully studying Su Gu, who, as before, continued to sit on one knee. The enemy's eyes seemed to widen, and something began to appear in them that was clearly not there before. The next moment, Qian Shui shouted at Wu Jing to be as careful as possible, making it clear that something was wrong. And indeed, the girl noticed how Su Gu suddenly jumped up from his seat and headed towards our hero. Now the young man no longer understood what was happening. It was difficult for him to understand where the enemy was getting the strength to do this. Grabbing the boy's arm and looking at him with an icy gaze, he angrily asked if the young man had played his games enough. Su Gu furiously attacked our hero, wondering again and again whether he really intended to surprise the teacher with such a sneaky trick. The enemies, responding to every blow from Wu Jin with defensive actions, seemed more interested in humiliating our hero than in the fight itself. However, the very next moment, Su Gu struck a blow that Wu Jin clearly did not expect. The young man coughed, and his eyes clearly showed how much pain he was in from his opponent's actions. Sitting on the floor, he heard Su Gu tell him that there was no spiritual energy in his body and he did not possess any martial techniques. He then added that the young man fights like a child, noting that it is unclear what he was taught or whether he was taught at all. After a short pause, Su Gu continued, and with an icy gaze said that if this was all this guy could do, then he would not be able to resist, and a certain death awaited him. However, before that happened, Su Gu was going to show off the full might of his clan. In the very next moment, the enemy, with joy on his face, raised his hand, as if addressing a heavenly stream, and asked it to descend upon him. Our hero, sitting on the ground and carefully watching what was happening, was about to say something, clearly not understanding what was happening. However, the next moment his gaze fell on Qian Shui, who, having grabbed the sword and shouted the guy's name, rushed somewhere or was about to attack someone. Although the girl didn't have time to do anything, her attention was drawn to Zhu Baiyu, who had soared into the sky and was right above her. In the blink of an eye, she was already standing in front of Qian Shui, taking a defensive stance and clearly hinting that she was going to engage in combat with our heroine. The brunette, in turn, understood what was about to happen, but it did not frighten her at all, which could be seen in her eyes. The woman in the man's body shouted that she would not allow anyone to insult her lover, and only Su Gu. But it seemed he didn't need anyone's help, because he stood there, enveloped in heavenly light, clearly about to strike our hero. Yin and Lu watched all this in horror, their mouths open in amazement, unable to say anything. The same applied to Qian Shui, as well as Bobo, who was also interested in the fate of his teacher. As for Wu Jin, he simply waited, looking at Su Gu and wondering what he should do. It was hard to read anything in Su Ji's eyes. It seemed as if he was completely and utterly consumed by the thirst for revenge and retribution. Gathering all his strength, he directed it towards where our hero stood, who was thrown back a second later. Wu Jin fell down and shouted something at the same time. It was clear that he was in a very difficult situation. And at that moment, the heavenly stream beat with such force that it seemed ready to blind everyone who was nearby. It was clear to everyone gathered that Su Gu was currently much stronger, and it was quite possible that he was about to gain the upper hand. Therefore, his comrades watched the events closely, and everyone except his opponents believed that Wu Jin would not be able to withstand the force that was only growing stronger with each passing minute. However, after a minute, everything became quiet. Su Gu stopped and looked closely at our hero, who was lying motionless on the ground right in front of him. A nearby assistant joyfully informed everyone gathered that it was all over for Wu Jin, which meant it was time to finish off everyone else as well. Brother Lu, who had recently disliked our hero, now declared with sadness in his eyes that he had counted on him in vain. Although Qin Yin categorically disagreed with him, noting that her mistress's task was not yet completed, and if that was the case, then they should not give up. However, looking at Wu Jin, who was still lying motionless on the ground, it seemed like the boys had less and less chance. Approaching our hero, Su Gu remarked with malice in his voice that scum will always remain scum. hinting that he was indifferent to the fate of the young man. He then added that he had endured humiliation and trained hard for 20 years, and now all this had played into his hands and allowed him to rise in the eyes of other people. Turning to his comrades, he shouted loudly that his happy day had finally come. And after a short pause, he noted that today his family had risen like a phoenix from the ashes. However, before he finished his speech, Sugu suddenly heard a familiar voice ordering him to finish and stop shouting so loudly and victoriously. Standing with his back to our hero, the villain clearly felt himself beginning to rise and be reborn. Gradually coming to his senses, Sugu asked his opponent, who replied that he had already won a victory, which he had managed to tell everyone about. It seemed that this sentence, like everything that was happening, greatly disturbed the representative of the Su family, who realized with horror that nothing was over yet. Turning around, he looked closely into the eyes of our hero, in which one could read confidence and the desire to win. This was no longer the boy who had been lying on the ground just a couple of minutes ago. This was a real warrior. A warrior enveloped in flames, a warrior capable of anything. He was the one who literally spewed forth the flames of power. Although the same Wu Jin that everyone knew stood before everyone gathered, it seemed as if he was a completely different person, a reborn hero. This was seen and understood by Su Gu, who, standing in his place, carefully studied the young man. Realizing that something was wrong, he assumed that the enemy was going to ask something, but he couldn't fully formulate his thought. But our hero was able to convey this by saying that all the fire he sees is blood torn out by the demonic spear. After a short pause, he asked a rhetorical question about whether it was warm and comfortable to be in such conditions. After a moment's thought, Wu Jin calmly added that different paths lead to the same goal. After a short pause, he added that everything that exists sooner or later merges into one. And to make sure the enemy understood what he was talking about, our hero decided to emphasize the word merger once again. He looked at Su Gu with a fierce expression one last time and asked him if everything was clear to him now. However, without waiting for an answer, he turned to himself and said that the result would only be achieved if he could resist, and added that it was worth spending 2,000 points. The young man thought to himself that despite the abundance of life energy in this gorge, he would not be able to constantly recover from serious injuries. After some thought, he decided that, without the ability to attack, the only way to defeat the villain was a protracted fight. Liang Zhou was still in the camp, so he couldn't hesitate for long. Having started to think about something, he remembered after a second that there were two more possible options in the exchange menu. With sadness in his eyes, our hero noted that this was not only about superpowers, but also about combat skills. The next moment, Wu Jin, as usual, turned to the system, carefully studying everything that appeared before his eyes. The young man began to quickly study something and switch between menu sections, clearly trying to find what interested him most. The very next second, the boy became interested in the art of picking random flowers, which are believed to enhance charm and attractiveness, and also provide protection when picking flowers. Having carefully considered this option, our hero came to the conclusion that there was only one woman among the enemies. However, the next moment, noticing out of the corner of his eye how this girl split a stone with one blow of her hand, he realized that her strength was by no means feminine. Imagining how, using this function, she, so large and impressive, would attract him to herself, the young man began to think. I thought about this only to finally realize that such a turn of events is already destructive in itself, and therefore it is better to abandon it. This was a good decision, as the menu also offered a golden cannon that, when struck repeatedly, would make the surface as hard as iron. After carefully examining the screen, Wu Jin realized that the second option was also highly questionable. After reading the description, the guy realized that by using such a function, he would have to accept defeat. Realizing that the choice was limited, our hero decided to agree and give preference to this particular product. After a brief hesitation, he quickly and decisively pressed the exchange button, which deducted points and credited the selected bonus. A moment later, Wu Jin noticed a flower fly past him, indicating that one of his comrades had entered the battle. A minute later, all of these plants flew towards Su Ji's assistant, indicating that Brother Liu had most likely gotten into a fight. A moment later, Qin Yan's abacus also flew over his opponent, indicating that the battle was in full swing. However, the next batch of flowers, from which an unusual light emanated, was still in the hands of a man who was clearly up to something. This state of affairs clearly did not suit the assistant, since he, of course, did not count on such power. And indeed, the next moment, Brother Lu's sword into the sky and scattered red flower buds so that they fell like stones right on the villain. Knowing what was about to happen, he clearly had no intention of waiting, so he hurried, resorting to unusual tricks to hide. Standing at some distance and holding his sword in front of him, as if defending himself from opponents, the assistant was thinking about something. There was a look of fear and uncertainty in his eyes about what was to come. He certainly didn't seem to be in the mood for victory. Therefore, the very next minute he began to shout and call for Sugu, and the assistant asked him to finish off this worthless person as soon as possible and come to his aid. Qin Yin, flying up behind the enemy, sarcastically told Sugu that he shouldn't be distracted, clearly hinting that they wanted to deal with the villain once and for all. And at that very moment, on the other side of the gorge, Miss Zhu angrily punched the ground, trying to scare her rival. Although it seemed that such a technique had no effect, since the girl was closely watching the actions of her opponent, she did not show any emotion. And a moment later it turned out that the red-haired girl in the man's body, who had been looking at her rival with horror, also realized this. And she was irresistible. Her very posture indicated that Qian Shui was full of determination and faith in victory. The next second, the brunette clutched the sword, showing her enemies that she, as before, was ready to fight and was not afraid of anything. Zhu Baiyu, with horror in her voice, wondered if the beauty was really going to break free by force and if she was really tired of living. However, our heroine was not embarrassed by such a question. She continued to stand silently, maintaining her confidence and steadfastness. Noticing Wu Jin's gaze, who was sitting a few meters away from her and carefully reading something, the brunette seemed to just want to buy time for the young man. Dissatisfied, she closed her eyes and did not move from her place, but did not say anything either. A couple of minutes later, Wu Jin stood up from his seat and heard Su Go ask him if he had taken any elixir and what he was going to do next. Rubbing his hands and with joy in his eyes, Su Go informed our hero that next time he was going to defeat the young man, and nothing would help him. Not wanting to argue or prove anything to the enemy, the guy grabbed his shoulder, as if showing that he was just warming up, and therefore the enemy hoped in vain that all this would end. The bird, looking closely at its owner, decided to encourage the young man, saying that he had to do what he had to do and would definitely succeed. Wu Jin was flattered by this support, but he didn't want to show his joy, so he simply told the parrot not to worry and to always stay behind. And a second later, he added that he was not one of those who simply mock birds. After these words, the young man froze for a few seconds, his face showing surprise and something else that was difficult to grasp. Wu Jin smiled at his hand and said out loud that he had an interesting idea, but he didn't voice it. And then he extended his right hand, crossed 3 fingers, and with the other 2, it seemed he was trying to call someone. And this is indeed so, because after this movement the guy, turning to the enemy, ordered him to approach him without fear. Su Go was clearly enraged by this behavior, and so, shouting and rushing towards our hero, he declared that this guy does not understand anything. Jin just crossed his arms, clenched his extra fingers, leaving only his index and middle fingers, and thought to himself that this technique was so effective. And just a minute later, heading toward the enemy with outstretched fingers, he was clearly trying to do something bad. But Suga didn't stand still either. He moved towards our hero and shouted something, but no one paid attention to him, and it was difficult to hear his words. Although this was not necessary, since the next moment, having approached each other, the young people were clearly planning a strike. What happened next is impossible to describe in words, because a thick column of dust formed in the place where the boys were. The next second, our hero's hand with battered and dislocated fingers could be seen on the ground. The young man himself was lying on the floor, but it was difficult to understand whether this was part of the plan or whether the enemy had managed to neutralize him. Towering over Wu Jin was a smug Su Gu, who, with joy in his eyes, assured the young man that no matter what he did, he would still not be able to win. Smiling, our hero, continuing to lie in the same way, calmly said to the enemy, or rather, asked him, if this was really all he could do. Suga didn't understand what our hero was talking about, and, moreover, it seemed that he completely didn't understand why he was still alive. However, the next moment, Wu Jin began to gradually come to his senses and uttered a strange phrase that sounded like a fusion. And again his right hand, which he could barely move just a few minutes ago, froze in some strange position. However, after just a couple of seconds, the opponent noticed that the splayed fingers had returned to a more natural position. Smiling, our hero slowly rose, turned to himself, and declared that he had not been mistaken. Moreover, the instructions did not specify which technique he could use it in, which proved very useful to him. And, spreading his fingers, he continued that although he was short, he still fit, but it was unclear what exactly the young man was talking about. And a minute later, raising his middle finger and rudely addressing his opponent, he noticed that one of his fingers was stronger than the opponent's fist. The enraged Su-gu looked at his enemy with displeasure, clearly wanting to deal with him as quickly as possible. However, not even a few minutes had passed before he began to attack Wu-jin again, shouting at him to shut up forever. And again the fight broke out. It was difficult to see anything because of the clouds of dust, but it was clearly possible to hear our hero mocking his enemy, hinting at his weakness and fragility. Pausing for a moment, Su-gu wondered where Wu-jin got the strength not only to recover, but also to fight so successfully. And then, turning to himself, he added that it was necessary to continue to wear down the enemy, so that he would not have time to recover. However, it turned out that our hero didn't care at all, because he was smiling and happy, and it seemed like there really was a reason for this. Looking at his middle finger, which was glowing like a light bulb, the young man noted to himself that his brilliant plan, as always, had been crowned with success. And for a moment, turning his gaze to the red spear, he again thought about something, clearly planning his next steps. After carefully examining his finger, the young man suddenly heard Qian Shui asking him if he was okay. The brunette looked closely at the young man, studying him, not understanding whether he was listening to her at that moment or was immersed in his own thoughts. But then the young man smiled and said with joy in his voice that the girl should not worry about him, because, as always, he had everything under control. Despite this, the beauty continued to look at our hero for some time, without saying a word. And literally a minute later the girl closed her eyes, as if letting the young man know that his answers completely satisfied her. Perhaps the brunette still wanted to say something, but the next moment Zhu Baiyu turned to her and told our heroine not to ignore her, continuing the fight she had started. All this clearly did not please Wu Jing, who at the last moment, carefully studying his opponent, uttered the name of his sister. Turning halfway, the young man realized that he too had a problem of his own, which at that particular moment was right behind him. The problem was the same as Su Ji's. He was furious and angry, looking closely at the young man, wanting to finish what he started as quickly as possible. He had this opportunity because the very next minute our hero asked the villain if he had ever heard of the system of mysterious Eastern movements of the swords of the six chakras, and, without waiting for an answer, realizing that he had driven his opponent into a corner, he decided not to stop and threateningly declared that he would turn him into a sieve. Wu Jin raised his index and middle fingers and pointed them at Su-gu. The effect was stunning, because at that very moment, fire erupted, moving toward the man. The enemy clearly did not like this turn of events, but he remained in place, frozen in place, awaiting further developments. And in the blink of an eye, the directed flame reached the ground next to where Su-gu was sitting. Looking at his smoking finger, our hero was both shocked and perplexed. The very next minute, he turned his gaze to the place where the flame had hit and noticed that it had completely incinerated him, as if the fire had been burning there for a very long time. As Wu Jin turned around and was about to leave, he heard Su-gu shout something after him. The word fool. Stopping for a moment, our hero heard the enemy ask with hatred in his voice whether what had happened a few minutes earlier was really the trump card the young man had spoken of. After a brief hesitation, the opponent added sarcastically that the young man could only make threats but was otherwise of little use. Straining his middle finger and reigniting the flame, which had become much stronger than the previous one, the young man, smiling, said that this was just a warm-up. Sitting down a little, he noticed that some unusual second form was waiting ahead of the attacker. Putting his finger to his face, he added that Su-gu was waiting for Ta. Although the guy did not explain what it was, but smoke similar to cigarette smoke had already started coming out of his mouth. And then something completely unexpected happened. Clenching his fists, as if about to fire a pistol, our hero shouted that it was a machine gun. For a moment, it seemed like the enemy was looking at Wu Jin as if he had gone slightly crazy. It looked rather strange because the two young men were standing opposite each other, and smoke was coming out of Wu Jin's finger like a gunshot. But nothing happened. There was such silence that both had questions, but no one dared to start a conversation. True, this did not last long, until Wu Jin, covered in sweat, shouted that for some reason his pistol had stopped reloading. Looking at the enemy, grimacing comically and scratching the back of his head, our hero tried to justify himself, explaining that this was probably a mistake. Su-gu looked at the young man with anger in his eyes and, calling him a worthless person, told him to stop talking nonsense and do a man's job. Wu Jin did not lose his composure and did not make excuses, but, looking closely at the enemy, ordered him to repeat all this after the victory. The next second, a bright flash of fire eclipsed everything that was possible. Looking at her, Su-Ji's eyes widened so much that she felt like she had nowhere else to go. A moment later, the enemy flew away somewhere, but it is unclear whether he was thrown back by our hero or some unknown force. It was also surprising that a red spot, reminiscent of a blood stain, was flying towards Su-Gu, but it was difficult to tell who it belonged to. Wu Jin was enveloped in a pleasant fiery light, but it did not burn him, showing that this light belonged to him and came from him. The same cannot be said of the opponent, who for a second covered his smoking left shoulder with his right hand. The enemy didn't understand what was happening to him. On one side his shoulder seemed intact, but on the other, for some reason, it was smoking. However, the very next minute our hero defiantly pointed his index finger and, laughing, asked Su-Gu if he really believed the actor's brilliant performance. And, pursing his lips like a pipe, he added that the enemy was naively convinced that the young man would not be able to hit him. Narrowing his eyes, Su-Gu repeated what he had already said several times in the evening. He told our hero to seriously anger him. And, looking carefully from under his eyebrows at Wu Jin, he laughed and repeated his name several times. As for the young man, he looked questioningly at his opponent, and then, in a calm voice, asked if he had really gone mad. Hearing this, Su-Gu waited, and the next second he jumped up from his seat and walked towards where the young man was standing. However, Wu Jin, on the contrary, did not move an inch, carefully observing his opponent and tracking his every move. It seemed his plans had changed too, because he stopped and looked into the guy's eyes just as closely. But the very next moment he abruptly turned his back on everyone gathered, so that the strange energy formation that started from his neck and ended on the floor did not go unnoticed by anyone. After carefully studying all this, Wu Jin did not dare to say or do anything, but it is safe to say that he did not expect such a scene. Seeing the surprise in her brother's eyes, Qian Shui quickly explained to him that Su-Gu was using the energy of the spiritual enlightenment realm. While continuing to fight with Zhu Baiyu, she shouted at the young man to run and save himself, as he would never be an equal opponent for Su-Gu. After thinking for a bit, our hero mentally asked himself if it was true that his opponent was cheating. However, the very next minute he was pulled out of his thoughts by the voice of his rival, who directly asked if it was true that the guy was very worried about the brunette. The young man's eyes widened. However, he remained silent for a moment, considering his words. Then he asked the villain a counter-question. Why was he touching the girl? After all, if he wanted to harm her, he could do so by fighting Wu Jin. Taking a close look at the young man, Su-Gu stated in an icy tone that he wanted him to watch his brunette's death closely. And after a little hesitation, he added that, of course, he could have pitted them, since he was a good-natured man, and let the boys die together. Jin's expression was impassive, and in a calm tone, the boy said that if even one hair fell out of the girl's head, he would bury the entire Su family. Perhaps our hero expected that these words would somehow catch the enemy off guard, but he only grinned and headed in his direction. Realizing that he had to act quickly, Wu Jin addressed the parrot, calling it by name. Clenching his fist and concentrating all his strength, Su-Gu asked the boy what other distracting tricks he had come up with. But the young man didn't shrug it off and came up with something, and so he boldly declared that his trick was called the Wolves Are Coming, without explaining what it was. Unable to wait for the show to begin, Su-Gu suddenly soared into the sky to begin the battle. However, his attention was constantly distracted by something else, because he was looking somewhere without taking his eyes off. The next second, Bobo suddenly appeared, also staring at someone. And while the bird's owner was dealing with Su-Gu, the parrot flew away victoriously, but at the same time it was tightly clutching the scarlet fire grass in its mouth. It seemed to begin to dawn on the enemy that this trick was not so simple, and so within seconds he looked closely at his belt. Realizing that something was clearly missing, Su-Gu shouted loudly, letting everyone know that something truly irreparable had happened. Clenching his fist, which was already blazing with flames, Wu Jin shouted that the enemy had gotten what he deserved, especially for the last words he had spoken. Watching our hero closely, Su-Gu seemed to see a fist engulfed in flames for the first time, with such genuine and at the same time childish horror. And this horror was justified, because in an instant the young man struck the villain with all his might, so that he felt all the hatred of the clan. This was not the same battle as before. Now it was filled with fire and energy, strength, and a genuine desire to win. Realizing that something was wrong, Miss Zhu froze and began screaming, demanding that Su-Gu be as careful as possible. However, the next minute, it was no longer possible to understand who was stronger and who was weaker, because a cloud of dust rose up around the opponents again. Suddenly, From all this horror, someone's foot in a black boot appeared, and everyone gathered realized who it was. Sugu, struggling to get out of this battle, called our hero's name again and again with hatred in his voice. In the very next moment, the attention of everyone gathered was drawn to Bobo, who, flying across the sky, suddenly spat out the grass that he had been holding in his beak all this time. This whole situation shocked Sugu, the owner of this factory, the most, as he seemed to have lost it forever. However, the story did not end there, because the flower continued to float in the air, and Bobo looked at it carefully, as if he had some plans for this plant. Apparently, Sugu himself had figured out this plan, and with a trembling voice he tried to say something, but only an incoherent muttering came out of his mouth. And indeed, the parrot had the most radical plans for the Scarlet Flame plant, because the next moment he burned the flower with a powerful fiery stream of his breath. And now the enemy could not bear it any longer. In his eyes one could see only horror, which seemed to have never existed, and, without feeling any embarrassment or fear, he loudly shouted no, although it was already too late to change anything. The assistant, who was watching everything that was happening, said with anger in his voice that without the grass, Sugu would not have been able to withstand the power of the spear. And the power of this stream was so great that with each passing minute it enveloped the valley more and more, and it seemed that it had already begun to approach the enemy. In an instant, the enraged and furious Sugu turned into a submissive and humble man, who bowed his head before the spear and stood there, unable to move. He seemed to want to say something, and that something was the word no, but only the first letter came out. The next moment, the clan representative began to be covered in a red veil that enveloped him from head to toe. It seemed as if he heard nothing, saw no one, and the most important thing for him was the spear lying right in front of him. With each passing minute, the curtain grew thicker and enveloped more and more the young man, who was still standing in place. The strange behavior of Sugu, who was clearly in a state of zombification and did not understand what was happening to him, did not escape the unwitting witnesses of all this. He simply stood and carefully examined the mountain on which was located the very weapon that guy had so wanted to get his hands on just a few minutes ago. A minute later, the girl with the male body spoke up, starting to scream loudly, calling for Sugu and doing everything she could to make him hear her and come to his senses. However, the next second, Qin Shui threw swords towards Zhu and shouted that she should under no circumstances wake up her lover. The red-haired girl, without getting up from her place, turned slightly to look in the direction from which the weapon was flying at her. Indeed, in a matter of seconds, Ms. Zhu Baiyu jumped up from her seat and rushed towards her opponent. She managed to dodge in such a way that the weapon that was flying at her crashed into the floor next to Qin Shui the next minute. And then, crying out and pronouncing the name of her beloved, she went towards him to do everything possible and save him. However, the path turned out to be not as simple as the girl initially thought, because it was immediately blocked by Wu Jin, who was interested in where the villainess was heading. Having carefully studied the enemy, our hero made it clear that he was not going to surrender, and especially did not want to surrender even in front of a girl, because his life and the lives of his comrades were at stake. Zhu Baiyu looked at the young man with fury in her eyes. Her gaze was filled with anger and hatred, determination, and a thirst for revenge. Realizing this, Qin Shui immediately ran to Wu Jin, informing him of her arrival and clearly hinting at the need for help. The two comrades stared at their opponent, who seemed to be at a dead end and did not understand how she should proceed further to save Sugu. She watched as the young man moved further and further away, approaching the mountain, and desperately tried to think of something. For a moment, the girl was lost in memories. She remembered how her brother taught her to ride a horse, how they ate together and to spend time together. Zhu Baiyu thought that this young man had always cared about her, and if so, then he would do so now, and she began to think. The girl took in as much air as she could and screamed that it was now her turn to take care of the guy and repay him with the same kindness with which he treated her. And a moment later, the opponent clenched her strong hand into a fist in which a fiery flame flared up. Our heroes felt that something had changed in her posture. She had become more confident and powerful. The girl's face was distorted with anger and indignation. Her whole appearance showed that she would not give up so easily and would do everything possible in her power. The powerful and muscular Zhu Baiyu, whose body already resembled that of a strong man, became even stronger and more powerful, which caused some confusion among our heroes. The next minute, an image of a boar belonging to the girl appeared before them. This was completely unexpected, but at the same time expected. Qin Shui turned to her brother and told him that the girl was most likely doing everything she could to elevate her kingdom, and therefore warned Wu Jin to be as careful as possible. Before our heroine could finish speaking, The next second, she was interrupted by the threatening voice of a guy who shouted that the enemy was flying straight at them. And in the blink of an eye, the girl landed violently next to our heroes, hitting the ground with a force that only she could muster. Wu Jin watched the scene carefully, considering his next move. After all, this was a representative of the fair sex, albeit a villain. However, as it turned out, this did not bother her at all, because she was clearly going to get into a fight with our hero. Threatening with a shout that Wu Jin would not be able to escape, she clenched her fist a second later to deliver a crushing blow. And if at first the young man did not really believe in it, now, realizing that the hand was already very close, he asked the red-haired girl if she was really going to do what she had planned. And this was indeed the case, because only the most negative emotions that she had expressed before were visible on her face. However, the strike was not destined to take place, as Madame Zhu noticed a sword flying towards her. In one movement, she fearlessly intercepted it, injuring her hand in the process, but she seemed not to notice this detail. The sword belonged to Qian Shui, who was carefully studying her opponent, making it clear that she would not allow her to mock Wu Jin so easily. And in the blink of an eye, the girl with the body of a man suddenly grabbed our heroine by the hand, showing that she didn't care who she would fight. The main thing was to achieve her goal. Indeed, Qian Shui did not fail, because she reacted quickly and took the most advantageous position for herself. The next minute, she delivered a kick to her opponent, which was completely unexpected for her, since it was extremely strong and accurate. The brunette, realizing that she had managed to temporarily stun her opponent lying on the ground, turned to Wu Jin, hinting that it was his turn to act. Our hero did not hesitate, and therefore ran up to the villain as quickly as possible to finish the job his sister had started. Having carefully studied his rival, the young man said with some understanding in his eyes that the red-haired girl had a kind soul, but despite this, he must protect the interests of his sister and his clan. The boy swung his arm, preparing to deliver his fire strike, and, still looking straight into Miss Zhu's eyes, asked her for forgiveness for what he was about to do. The next moment, fire pierced the girl inside the man's body. From the expression on her face, it was clear that the young man had indeed managed to seriously wound his opponent. However, it seemed that Zhu Baiyu was not thinking about herself, but about her lover, or rather, she was going to help him, but only made the situation worse. With horror in her eyes, continuing to look in the direction where Su Ge was still standing, she tried to shout his name in the hope that he would wake up and hear her. However, this did not happen, because the next moment the girl was lying on the ground, unable to move. Standing next to his defeated opponent, Wu Jin turned to Qian Shui and asked the brunette if she was injured and if everything was okay. Closing her eyes, either from fatigue or from everything that had happened over the past few days, the girl quietly said that she was fine. However, the very next minute our hero was distracted by something else, and he turned to his sister in a decisive voice. The young man added that their two companions looked extremely tense and exhausted. But before he could say anything, Qian Shui intervened, stating that they definitely needed help. Lu and Qin Yin did their best to defeat the hapless assistant, and after realizing what had happened a moment ago, they began to convince him that the battle was lost for him. However, it seemed like the man still had some hope, or wanted to think so. Although looking at Su Ge, it was safe to say that he was of little use. True, it was also difficult to count on help from the girl lying on the ground, because she received a very strong blow. And a moment later, looking the truth in the eye and with hatred in his voice, the assistant declared that his comrades were completely useless. As a result of the battle, the enemy found himself on the edge of the abyss the very next moment and was about to fall from it. Realizing that the situation was on the brink and there was no other way out, the assistant thought for a second and then decided that he had only one trump card left, which he would certainly use. Suddenly, squatting down and addressing everyone in a calm voice, the man declared that they really did have abilities that had initially been underestimated. However, after a moment's thought, looking closely at our heroes, he added in an icy tone that, as sad as it was for him to report it, the time had come to end the games. Lu and Qin Yin, who were closest to the assistant, did not understand what he was talking about, because it seemed like he was about to give up. But he peered attentively into the sky, as if expecting some kind of answer or help from above. And indeed, the next moment the man screamed very loudly, turning to Master Zhua and asking him to come to his aid. All four of our heroes looked at their ill-wisher with bewilderment and at how quickly events were changing, not knowing what to expect next. And then something unexpected happened, because it felt like the stars were falling from the sky to the earth. Everything was so strange. The boys thought that a strong storm was approaching the gorge, because a strong wind arose, which tore a tree out by its roots and lifted it into the air. Realizing that the craft was about to fall to the ground and could land anywhere, Lu shouted loudly for everyone to take cover. Despite the complexity of the situation, Wu Jin managed to express his point of view and say that they themselves knew what to do in such a situation. However, before he could finish speaking, the large, perennial tree very quickly fell to the ground. The airflow was so powerful that in an instant, Qin Yin and Lu, who were standing closest, were blown away. Following them, Wu Jin and Qian Shui, who were a little further away, fell. The tree turned and continued to fall with a crash. It sounded like rocks were falling, and this was no ordinary oak. The next second, our heroes noticed a pair of legs, not yet understanding who they belonged to. True, a minute later, an unpleasant picture opened before their eyes. On a fallen tree stood a man whom Wu Jin had already met before. Our hero didn't even need to tell his friends who it was, because a moment later an assistant called out, "Greeting Lord Zua." Dressed in fine clothes and with a proud expression on his face, he squinted and looked around at everyone in the valley, clearly wanting to demonstrate his superiority. Brother Lu, still holding his hand to his cheek, asked in confusion what this man's name was. Rubbing his head, covered in bruises from the fall, Wu Jin was puzzled by how the man had appeared so quickly, but the next minute he heard a warning from Qian Shui, who told him not to make any sudden movements. However, it was not our hero who began to make sudden movements, but Elder Zua, jumping from the tree, quickly ran towards the mountain on which the spear was still located. Looking closely at his cherished goal, the man considered what to do next. And then, with enthusiasm and a smile in his voice, he announced that he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Suddenly, an assistant ran up to Zua, holding a small vessel in his hands, and, handing it to the man, said that it contained a magical essence. It was the essence of blood that the man was going to present to his master, but our heroes were not entirely clear why he needed it. Zua was clearly waiting, carefully looking at Su Gu, who resembled some kind of zombie and was completely useless. For a moment, lingering beside him, he thought that it seemed as if this gentleman was going to somehow resolve this situation. Indeed, the next second, the man voiced what he had been thinking a minute ago. It was said that the Su clan representative was now completely useless. And indeed, everything was so, as the young man simply stood with an empty gaze, watching everything that was happening around him. At some point, the herb of scarlet flame appeared in the ruler's hands, but our heroes still did not understand what he was going to do with it. As I lifted it up, I saw it open up and transform into an incredibly beautiful flower that was breathtaking. The next second, everyone's attention turned to the weak-willed Su Gu, who was still standing in place. The light of life and common sense finally shone in his lifeless eyes. Su Ji's eyes were filled with curiosity, and he began to ponder over what had happened to him and where he was at this particular moment, as if he did not understand or remember what had happened. He looked at the man carefully, not having the slightest idea where he came from or why he was there at all. However, he didn't dare ask anything, watching Zwa carefully as he sprayed the essence around himself. Blood flowed, not only onto the ground, but also onto the skeletons of animals that had fallen victim to the same spear. Apparently, Zwa did not spare the essence, and therefore tried to pour out as much as possible, clearly expecting some kind of effect. And this effect did not take long to appear, because after just a minute the spear began to shimmer pink. It felt like new life was being born within it, because after a couple of seconds a small fireball appeared around it, clearly filling the object with energy and power. The spear seemed to have changed somewhat. It became sharper and somewhat resembled a cleaver. Zwa, who had been watching everything happen, was the only one who knew what the end result should be, and he was not surprised that something went wrong, so he thoughtfully noted that he needed 2 more essences, not 1. And the very next second his stern gaze began to stare intently at one of our heroes. In turn, Su Gu, standing behind the ruler, seemed to be trying to catch his thoughts. Time seemed to stand still as Will looked around at the assembled group again, unable to single out anyone. But the same could be said about Su Gu, who watched in shock, not understanding what the master did not understand, and, most importantly, what his ultimate goal was. Our hero's opponent was about to say something, but he couldn't collect his thoughts and therefore, as before, continued to remain silent. Finally, Zhu Baiyu broke the silence and, in a calm voice, turned to the master and told him that he could use her blood if he wanted. Su Gu slowly turned his head and looked closely at his bride, who had essentially voluntarily decided to sacrifice herself. Zwa also turned around, but for some reason he chose to remain silent, perhaps because the man had not yet made a final decision. The red-haired girl with the body of a man carefully studied her comrades, but was in no hurry to speak anymore. Suga was the first to burst into tears, screaming and asking the bride why she decided to offer herself as a bride. In a calm voice, she simply stated that everything was clear to her, and she understood that without this the goal would not be achieved. Zhu Baiyu added that for the sake of the young man's dream, her bloodline meant nothing, and she was willing to sacrifice her life, even if it meant she had to. The guy looked closely at the girl, and it seemed that he still did not fully understand the seriousness of the situation they had gotten themselves into. However, the very next moment, with his head down and sadness in his eyes, the young man began to ask his bride for forgiveness. She smiled and quickly interrupted him, saying that she had always asked him not to ask her for forgiveness for anything. The green essence bottle was already in front of Zhu Baiyu, making it clear that she should use it, or rather, fill it, and do so without delay. And the girl really wasn't going to hesitate, because a moment later she brought her index finger to her mouth and bit it very hard. This was enough to puncture the wound and collect much-needed blood. To Miss Zhu's amazement, the liquid gushed into the bottle at an incredible speed, and it seemed that soon there would not be a drop of blood left in her body. She watched everything that was happening with horror and did not fully understand what was about to happen. After a short time, the bottle was filled almost to the top. Zhu Baiyu, who had been so cheerful and happy just a couple of minutes ago, suddenly began to weaken sharply, because weakness and helplessness were visible in her gaze. Kneeling down and raising her bloody finger, she continued to examine the bottle closely. However, the next moment, the situation changed dramatically because the girl, closing her eyes, began to fall somewhere. Everyone gathered carefully examined the small container, filled to the brim with blood, which indicated that Miss Zhu was bloodless. Realizing this, Sugu immediately ran up to her, grabbed her by the shoulders, and, hugging her, asked his beloved to wake up and tell him something. Opening her eyes slightly, she merely whispered that all these years the young man had protected her and done everything possible for her, and that what she had done now was only a small contribution to the common cause. Sugo looked at his fiancée in horror, unsure how he could help her or influence everything that was happening. He tried to say something, but it didn't come out well. The next second the girl went limp, and looking at her with a gloomy expression on his face, the young man silently thanked her for her sacrifice. It seemed that all this did not touch the elder Zwa at all, who, holding a bottle in his hands, mockingly said that all this was very touching. And with a slight smile, he added in an icy tone that he meant falling in love and being attached to someone. However, the very next minute the ruler clearly forgot about what had happened, because he began to pour essence onto himself and around himself. He watched with pleasure as the spear filled with more and more energy and power with each passing minute. It seemed to be more and more reminiscent of a cleaver or execution sword, as its appearance was as menacing and intimidating as possible. Looking from under his eyebrows at everything that was happening, with hatred in his eyes, Elders was said that all this was not enough, more was needed. And, turning half a turn, he froze, as if studying our heroes and considering his next step. All four stood together. No one was going to leave or do anything, clearly waiting for some move from their opponents. The first to break the silence was Zwa, who, in the same icy tone and mockery, remarked that they had the great honor of freeing the spear and dying from it. It seemed that our heroes did not react to the villain's words at all, because they stood with impassive faces and simply looked at him. In the very next moment, turning his gaze to Qian Shui, the opponent declared that he had decided to choose the girl for this purpose. With a smile on his face and the same sarcastic tone, he once again noted that our heroine had the honor of freeing the spear. Coming closer to the beauty, Zwa, looking closely into her eyes, ordered her to do it immediately. However, the brunette remained silent, her gaze piercing and absolutely calm. The same cannot be said for Wu Jing, who was seething with rage and felt that he had to do something to prevent trouble, and so spoke again, turning to the beauty and told her not to be afraid, because he was very lenient towards beauties. The next minute the man added that she was very attractive, especially when she was angry. And a moment later he reached out to her face, noticing that her makeup was very smudged and needed correction, which he would be happy to help with. Seeing such frivolous behavior, Wu Jin suddenly jumped up from his seat and walked towards the enemy, shouting at him to get away from his sister and calling him the most rude names. The villain, looking contemptuously at our heroes, did not utter a word. A minute later, our hero directed a stream of his fiery power towards where the villain stood. The young man clearly did not understand what had happened, noticing that his opponent had taken and parried his blow with one movement. Before he could say anything, the villain's strong hand instantly grabbed him by the neck and began to strangle him. Having lifted our hero above the ground, Zwa asked him in an angry tone what he was doing in this valley, noting that he only imagined himself to be a hero, although in fact he was pathetic and insignificant. Watching this, Qian Shui let out a loud scream and turned to Wu Jin, trying to somehow intervene or influence the situation. Jan grabbed her hand, telling her not to be reckless and to think about herself too. It seemed that Zwa didn't even notice this because, continuing to squeeze the guy's neck, he said how lucky the young man was that the beautiful brunette was worried about him. Maddened by anger and pain, Wu Jin could think of nothing else but to bite his enemy's thumb with all his might. However, he icily remarked that the beautiful Qian Shui seemed to have very poor taste in men. Suddenly the conversation was interrupted by Bobo, who, as if descending from heaven, shouted loudly, asking his villain to release his master. However, before the bird could do anything, Zwa suddenly struck it in the side with a heavy hand. And so that Bobo would no longer distract the man, he directed the flow of his power in the direction where the bird was again. Lying on the ground, the parrot said that before he had time to appear, he had already been disarmed and practically taken out of the game. In the very next moment, the enemy continued the work he had begun to destroy Wu Jin, declaring that he had many friends, but, unfortunately, they were all losers. And again, squeezing our hero even tighter, he added that no one would come to the aid of the young man, because there was simply no one to come. From the expression on the young man's face, one could tell that his strength was waning and that the villain was about to gain the upper hand over our hero. He turned pale and weakened, but was unable to resist Zwa, who was much stronger than the young man. Unlike everyone else, Qian Shui clearly had no intention of giving up, so he suddenly started running towards the young man. She ran screaming, and the villain, with an evil grin, looked at the guys and called them all the scum of society. A minute later, he let go of our hero and threw him forcefully in the opposite direction, carefully examining the brunette. And she, in turn, could not take her eyes off the weak and exhausted body of Wu Jin, who was still in flight. Brother Lu was watching him closely, as was Qin Yin, who stood a little to the side, unable to do anything. However, the very next second, Zwa spoke again and continued the phrase he had started earlier about how all the trash should be thrown out. He looked closely at the spear, which continued to thirst for someone's blood and new victims. And in the blink of an eye, the sacrifice was made, for our hero's body fell upon the spear, mercilessly piercing it. Qian Shui watched in horror, unable to believe her eyes and unable to accept the fact that her brother was no longer alive. Qin Yan's voice was filled with confusion as she turned to her friends and shouted loudly, "How could this happen?" Realizing that Lu, who was standing next to her, was in complete despair. However, the next moment the brunette froze in place, extending her right hand, which seemed to grab something. She looked closely at the scarlet fire grass lying between the bones that once belonged to animals. In an instant, beauty began to attract this plant, clearly plotting something interesting. And indeed, that was the case, because the next moment, everyone gathered noticed that Qian Shui was tightly clutching the grass in his hand. It seemed that Lu understood our heroine's intention, and so he shouted loudly, warning her not to do what she was about to do. True, the beauty did not hear him or did not want to do this, because she brought the plant to her mouth, clearly intending to eat it. Watching Qian Shui closely, his companions, a boy and a girl, suddenly shouted about some kind of breakthrough. They carefully examined the girl, who had noticeably changed. Her posture conveyed a strength and confidence that had not been there before. The eyes had also changed. Now they'd become dispassionate and fearless. There was no pity or sadness visible in them. It seemed as if the girl had been placed in some sort of greenish block, full of strength, but at the same time icy cold, as evidenced by the ice and snowflakes flying around. Zwa, who had been carefully examining the beauty, grinned maliciously and wanted to say something, but hesitated for a moment. A minute later, he asked the girl why she was trying to break through. Was it really all for some nonsense? However, the beauty, full of courage and strength, stood silently and stared at her opponent, not intending to involve him in her plans. And the villain spoke again, in the same icy tone, noting that the girl was very stupid, because she was ready to sacrifice thousands in order to then destroy tens of thousands. But his words no longer touched the beauty. In a dispassionate tone, she declared that she would kill the enemy, even at the cost of her own life. It seemed like Zwa either misunderstood everything the brunette said or continued to play with her, because, smiling, he said again that he liked how angry she was, and therefore he wanted to enjoy it again and again. But a minute later, something completely unexpected for the villain happened. The girl jumped up from her seat and quickly ran towards the ill-wisher, leaving ice shards behind her. His eyes widened. He clearly didn't expect such lightning speed, which he muttered out loud. taking out a knife that glinted in the cold. Qian Shui clearly had no intention of wasting any more time on conversation and was full of determination. The next moment, the tip of the beauty's weapon flew past the enemy's face, clearly letting him know that the game was over. So he tried to hit the girl, but she was more like an ice sculpture that was impossible to penetrate. And this is indeed true. Not only did he not harm the beauty, but an icy obstacle appeared in front of him that was very difficult to overcome. A second later, some kind of icy flashed through the enemy, so far that he flew very far away. Exhausted, sitting on the ground and rubbing his hand, for the first time he looked scared and did not know what to do next, not fully understanding where the girl got such strength from. Shui was stunned, unable to resist or oppose her in any way. The man saw that the brunette was not going to stop and was again preparing to deal a crushing blow to her attacker. Breaking the ice beneath her feet, she moved towards her villain, enveloping him in the icy cold that was her main weapon at that moment. Lu, who was standing nearby, turned to Qin Yin and asked the red-haired beauty how the brunette managed to attack the enemy and how her strength grew so quickly. The red-haired girl, with horror in her eyes, said that she was afraid of the opposite effect, which was quite likely. And at that very moment, Qian Shui, without slowing down, continued to drive Zhua into a corner, and, judging by the ice spikes under his feet, she was doing it perfectly. Standing in the middle of the snow-covered needles, the villain was perplexed as to how all this was possible. He was about to ask something, but clearly could not find the right words. Zhua looked at the edge of the ice floes and thought to himself that this was all very dangerous. One wrong move, and he could fall into the icy, deadly embrace of the ice. However, before the man could think about anything else, the next moment the girl raised her sword and quickly walked towards him. The enemy froze, unable to move, and realized that the tip of the blade was only a few centimeters from the bridge of his nose. It seemed as if the beauty was about to deliver a crushing blow, but a moment later something changed in her. She became gloomy and began to lose strength. If at first everyone thought that it was just an illusion, then, having noticed how the heavy sword fell from the girl's hands, it became clear to everyone that her strength was leaving her. A minute later, an exhausted Qian Shui lay on the floor in front of the villain, unable to get up or even move. Qin Yin and Brother Lu looked at the beauty in amazement, clearly desperate and unable to understand how she could not have just a few minutes to finish the battle. This state of affairs clearly suited the villain, who carefully studied the girl with a grin and thought that she had picked up and played out her childish games. He triumphantly threw back his head and looked at the sky, smugly shouting that they had arranged a real holiday for him, because he would bury absolutely everyone in the valley. Lu clearly didn't like this turn of events, so he turned to his girlfriend and said that things were going badly for them, and that this was probably the end. But that was not the end, because the girl's weak hand reached for the hilt of the sword, intending to finish what she had started. Zhou watched the brunette closely, but was not going to do anything, waiting for some action from her. The next moment, everyone heard the sound of metal hitting ice. It was a sword piercing the icy ground. After this, gradually, our heroine began to rise, and each of her movements was made with great difficulty. Some parts of her face were icy, indicating the icy cold that lived within her and grew stronger with increasing force. Zhou squatted down and asked Qian Shui why she was trying so hard for some loser she didn't need. And then he added that if the girl behaved well, as expected, then he would love her simply for her appearance. And the next moment, grabbing the girl by the throat, he lifted her above the ground, angrily declaring that those who go against him will always die by his own hands. Closing her eyes, the beauty thought with horror that perhaps all this would finally come to an end. In her mind, she turned to Wu Jin, wishing for some miracle to happen and for the young man to hear her. However, he did not hear this, but everything that was happening was seen by two of the girl's comrades, who rushed towards the enemy with lightning speed, shouting for him to be left alone. The boys might have succeeded, but the humble servants will block their path and push them back. And, raising his hand, which was not at all manly, with anger in his voice, he asked where the young people were heading so quickly. The next second, Zhou turned to the girl, noting that her spiritual blood looked delicious, and expressed the hope that the demonic spear would certainly like it. However, having grabbed the girl by the throat again, the enemy suddenly heard a strange voice, which said that it had previously asked him to take his hands off Qian Shui and not touch her again.